Chapter 34. Jack stared at the ammunition park. He had never seen such might assembled in one place. The siege train had finally arrived, the enemy's attempt to prevent it reaching the ridge thwarted by Nicholson and his men, and it was enormous. The train had been some 8 miles long, a grand procession of elephants, bullock carts, camels and horses. It had brought with it 32 heavy howitzers and mortars, along with 400 European infantry, the Baluch battalion, and a large body of Sikh cavalry. Finally, the battered, sick, and exhausted men on the ridge possessed the means to reduce the walls of Delhi to so much rubble. The mood in the camp changed overnight. The silent despair that had wrapped its cloying hands around the throat of the British had been replaced by the gentle caress of hope. Everyone knew the heavy siege weapons would mean change. The long stalemate was about to be broken. The 653 hackery carts that had formed part of the siege train had been packed full of ammunition, the shrapnel shells, round shot and canister that the artillerymen would need to batter away into Delhi. With the piles of ammunition came great mountains of gabions, fascines, gun platforms, wooden frames for magazines, sandbags, entrenching tools and scaling ladders. The siege was surging to completion, the intent of the British laid out in the neat lines of equipment. "And so it begins." Jack turned and offered a thin-lipped smile. He was spending more and more time with Nicholson, even though he was still officially under Hodson's command. The two officers had come to see the massive park that was the talk of the cantonment. What will they do first? Jack wanted to know. His patience was stretched thin by the purgatory of waiting. First will come the batteries. We have enough Punjabi sappers here to dig as many as we need. Baird Smith has the plan ready. He knows his business. Baird Smith. Jack did not recognize the name. It was hard to keep track of who was in charge of what. On the ridge outside Delhi, promotion happened fast. He commands the engineers. He arrived here in early July. I know him. He's a good man. His first task will be to attack the Muri and Kashmir bastions. It will be bloody work, I'm sure. The enemy has guns that will be able to hit our batteries, but once we have silenced those 2 bastions, we will be able to turn our fire on the wall itself. And then? And then we attack. Nicholson did not look at Jack as he spoke. He was staring into the distance, as if seeing the assault that was to come. Do you still want to lead? Yes. Jack had never wanted anything as much. Since the battle at the canal, he had thought of little else. Then you shall. I give you my word. For the first time, Nicholson looked at Jack. Will you tell me what drives you? No. Jack's reply was curt. The Lord can forgive. He can wash away your sins. Only He can offer you absolution. Jack winced. He had never been a godly man. To his mind, the afterlife was something for the rich to dwell upon. The poor were too busy trying to survive to spend long worrying about their souls. You would do well to think of your future, the one that matters. I'll think on it. Jack was evasive, uncomfortable under Nicholson's gaze. Would you pray with me? Sir? Jack did not know what to say. Come, let us pray together. Nicholson reached forward and pulled at Jack's sleeve, forcing him to his knees. He gave no sign of heeding the stares that were directed their way. Jack could think of no way to escape. So he knelt with his general, bowing his head as the man the whole camp looked to for deliverance prayed for his soul. Delhi must be taken, and it is absolutely essential that this should be done at once. If Wilson hesitates any longer, I intend to propose at today's meeting that he should be suspended. Nicholson paused his pacing and faced the two officers who waited with him as he prepared to attend General Wilson's council of war. Fred Roberts squirmed under his commander's gaze before lifting his chin, rallying well despite his misgivings. "With Brigadier Chamberlain wounded, that would place you in command, sir." Nicholson's brow furrowed. Jack did not doubt the general knew that salient fact, yet he was beginning to get to know Nicholson's mannerisms. In some ways he was like Hodson. Both men enjoyed the drama of the moment, and neither could resist playing the role of reluctant hero. "I have not overlooked that fact. I shall make it perfectly clear that under the circumstances I could not possibly accept the command myself, and I shall propose that it be given to Campbell of the 52nd. I am prepared to serve under him for the time being, so no one can accuse me of being influenced by personal motives." Jack did his best not to snort aloud. Nicholson knew exactly what he was about. The general spotted the poorly concealed reaction. "So you doubt my motives, Jack?" Jack felt no fear at facing the imposing man. "I do. You leave yourself open to criticism. There are men here who would seize upon any chance to blacken your reputation. You need not give them such ready ammunition." Nicholson raised his hand and scratched at his beard as he thought on Jack's advice. "They will say what they please, no matter my actions. I must do what I believe needs to be done. My own reputation means nothing against the greater need of our mission here." Jack blanched at the sanctimonious phrasing. "You will need to watch your back." To Jack's surprise, Nicholson guffawed at the pessimistic advice. "I must. I will do as you say. But it is a challenge, I admit." "I think it would be wise to heed Jack's advice, sir." Fred Roberts's young face was creased with concern for his master's reputation. "Perhaps you do need protection." "No one will try to come at me in the dark." Nicholson chuckled at Roberts's distress. "I cannot think of any man willing to risk encountering Muhammad Hayat Khan." Jack nodded in agreement. Nicholson was referring to his Pathan bodyguard. It would be a fool who would risk a fight with a formidable warrior who had sworn his life to defend the British general. "But perhaps you are right that I need protection of a different sort. A witness, as it were, to ensure that I am not laid open to accusations of wrongdoing." "Oh, a capital idea, sir." Roberts seized on the suggestion. "You need an aide-de-camp, but someone not from your own command, someone independent." Nicholson looked at Jack. "Perhaps an officer from my rival's command would suit the role very well. What say you, Jack? Will you leave Hodson and come with me to safeguard my reputation?" Jack could not have cared less about maintaining Nicholson's saintly image, but he did care about making sure he was in the front rank of the assault on Delhi. "I accept." Nicholson had his protection, and Jack had his place. "There will be no relief, sir. We are quite alone. We must strike." Nicholson slapped his right hand into his open palm to emphasize his point. "Cawnpore has fallen. Agra is besieged, and Sir Henry is dead. Havelock has been forced to suspend his attempt to reach Lucknow, which remains under siege. It is down to us. The country, nay, the whole empire is watching us. We cannot fail." "You speak well, General Nicholson. Indeed, you do." General Archdale Wilson, the commander of the battered British army, pulled at his sparse grey beard. He was a thin man in his mid-50s with a smattering of smallpox scars on his cheeks. Next to Nicholson, he looked old and tired. Jack sat on a camp chair on the periphery of the conversation. He had remained at Nicholson's tersely worded request when the other aides had been dismissed. It showed how Nicholson was regarded that no one dared gainsay his demand. He recognised most of the officers who sat around the campaign table in Wilson's command tent, and who now made up the Council of War. Captain Daly was there, the commander of the Corps of Guides, who had fought like devils in the weeks since they had arrived on the ridge. At Daly's side was one of Wilson's advisers, Lieutenant Colonel Baird Smith, the commander of the engineers, whom Nicholson had spoken of in such favourable terms. The engineer officer looked sick. Jack had been told that he had been wounded weeks before, and it seemed likely it would carry him off before long. Barely half a dozen other officers were there, but together those present would decide the fate of the city they had been besieging for months. Jack was surprised not to see Hodson in the gathering. All the surviving senior officers were present. He sensed Nicholson's hand in Hodson's exclusion. As the second most senior officer on the ridge, Nicholson's word carried great weight, yet he could not order an assault. Only General Wilson could give the command that would see the British forces attempt to take the city. "I cannot believe we have the numbers." Wilson's face looked as grey as his beard. His face sagged, the weight of the responsibility heavy. So many are sick. Jack had to bite his tongue. This was the same discussion he had witnessed all those weeks before, when General Barnard had faced the walls of Delhi for the first time. So many had died in the intervening weeks and months, yet still the generals prevaricated and delayed. Nicholson got to his feet, no longer able to maintain his facade of calm. "It is down to us. We must attack before we're all dead. 3,000 souls lie in the hospital, with more falling sick each day. How long must we endure? Must we wait until there is nothing left on this ridge but bleached bones? Sir, I urge you, give the order. Let Baird Smith make us a breach and let us attack." Wilson looked at Nicholson. To Jack he appeared like nothing more than a frightened old man, his rheumy eyes glazed with the fear of committing his men to an assault that might fail. "I shall not be party to any more delay." Nicholson spoke again, his tone like ice. He laid the threat naked on the table. "Now, there is no need for such language, even from you, Nicholson." Brigadier Chamberlain spoke for the first time. His uniform jacket was left open, revealing the swathe of bandages that covered the wound he had taken a few days previously. He was officially on the sick list, but he had been summoned to attend the meeting even though he no longer had any duties, his position as one of Wilson's closest advisers requiring his attendance. "This is a council of war. It's not Parliament. We must remain united in this endeavour." The effort of standing up to Nicholson appeared to take its effect on the man, and he slumped back into his chair as he succumbed to a bout of coughing that had him reaching for a handkerchief to cover his face. Nicholson's distaste was obvious, but whether it was at the man's illness or his choice of words, Jack could not tell. "We, could wait for more men. There will be more sent from England." Major Norman, Chamberlain's replacement as Adjutant General, spoke for the first time, but there was little conviction in his words. "There will be no more men." Nicholson was cruel in his denial. "Not for many months." "Perhaps." Norman's reply was tetchy. He was responsible for the day-to-day administration of the troops on the ridge, and was the only officer present who truly knew just how many men were available for any assault. He leant forward and snatched a ledger from the campaign table. "On paper, we number 11,000. But of those, 2,000 come from the Maharaja of Jammu, and so are of an unknown quality." "How many are listed sick?" Wilson's voice was scratchy as he posed the question. "Nigh on 3,000, sir." Norman was respectful. General Nicholson was correct on that account. Some regiments are badly affected. The 52nd are down to 242 men listed as fit for duty. They only arrived a few weeks ago with 600. And what of the enemy? What are their numbers? Wilson stared hard at Norman. Hodson has them at 36,000. I believe that to be an exaggeration. I would state their numbers to be closer to 30. Norman did not flinch from giving the daunting tally. Wilson shook his head slowly and sat back, contemplating the numbers. It is not enough. More men will come from the south. There are no more men, sir. Nicholson spoke softly now, his voice full of reason and understanding. We must attack now, before the sickness that plagues the army reduces us still further. We must attack whilst we still can. I can make the breach. Baird Smith spoke on Nicholson's side. Why bring the siege train all this way and not use it to full effect? That could only be seen as a criminal waste. Wilson stared at his hands clasped together on the table in front of him. There is something else, sir. Baird Smith sounded weary. The enemy are building a new battery of their own. They are preparing to enfilade the position our batteries would take if we were to attempt to produce a breach. If we allow them the time, then any assaults from the north will no longer be practical. We'll have to look elsewhere. So, I have no choice. Wilson sounded fragile. You must order the attack! Nicholson snapped at the words like a trout going for a juicy fly. You must! The room fell silent. Wilson still stared at his hands. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at Nicholson. So be it. General Nicholson, I would task you with planning the assault. Gentlemen, please give him your fullest assistance. Sir. Nicholson struck a dramatic pose as he absorbed the news he had pushed for with such iron determination. I would suggest Campbell of the 52nd take... No. Wilson interrupted Nicholson with surprising force. The command is yours, and yours alone. Nicholson said nothing. He turned on his heel and swept out of the tent. Jack leapt to his feet and followed him. They were barely outside before Nicholson turned to face Jack, his face betraying his elation. I've seen lots of useless generals in my day, but such an ignorant, croaking obstructive as he, I've hitherto never met with. You got what you wanted, sir. Jack felt something stir in his own heart. He did not recognize what it was. What I wanted? No, Jack, it was never that. It is what has to be done, nothing more. It is over to the engineers now. Let them make the breach. Then we shall finish what we came all this way to do. Chapter 35. Delhi Ridge, 8th of September 1857. The siege guns were supposed to open fire with the dawn. The first battery had been started as soon as the Council of War had been concluded. It was to be constructed in two parts. The right half would face the Maury Bastion, which was no more than 700 yards distant. In it, Baird Smith planned to sight 5 18-pounder cannon and 1 8-inch howitzer, giving them the order to destroy the bastion and unseat the guns that were mounted behind its walls. In the left half of the battery would be 4 24-pounders, which would fire on the Kashmir bastion. As the sun rose, the 10 heavy guns should have begun the long barrage that would see the proud walls of Delhi reduced to so much dust. But the gunners were not ready. Their batteries only half dug and the heavy guns yet to be manoeuvred into position. The orders to begin the bombardment had simply come too late for the enormous task to be completed during the night. As the sun crept into the sky, the enemy gunners in the Maury bastion opened fire. Their cannon fired without pause, using both round shot and grape to spread death and destruction through the ranks of native coolies ordered to sight the British guns. Dozens died, their smashed and broken bodies dragged out of the works and fresh men sent forward to take their place. The bodies were brought back to the far side of the ridge to be laid out in great long rows, the silent ranks a testament to the passive bravery of the men who had laid down their lives so that the gunners could go about their destructive work. By the afternoon, the first British guns were finally ready to return fire. The gunners opened the barrage using round shot, the iron balls smashing into the walls of the Maury bastion. Huge rolling clouds of dust were thrown high into the air as the artillery fired in great rolling salvos, the pattern of shot dictated by the engineer's scheme, which had been calculated with meticulous care. Baird Smith and his officers had planned the destruction of the ancient walls with the attention to detail that other men had once used in their construction. The enemy fire slackened as the heavier British guns found their range. By nightfall, nothing remained of the Maury bastion but a heap of smouldering rubble. With its first target destroyed, the battery turned its fire on the Kashmir bastion. Over the course of the following days, 3 more batteries were dug. All took punishment from counterfire coming from the walls. The enemy were not blind, and they saw the huge scars on the ridge as the sweating coolies dug out the ground ready for the siege guns. Muskets, rockets, and round shot ploughed into the newly constructed firing platforms, smashing the carefully aligned gabions before plunging into the teams of gunners working tirelessly to bring their precious cannon into action. Enemy cavalry made countless sorties, forcing the engineers to pack the newly dug trenches with infantry to defend the guns. Men who needed to be rested and fresh for the long-awaited assault spent their days and nights fighting off wave after wave of rebel attacks before enduring the pitiless artillery fire that was directed against them in the hours between raids. The siege guns were firing as fast as they could. All day and all night the gunners worked in teams to keep up a constant barrage on the city. The coordinated firing was taking effect, and occasionally a great cheer would erupt from the battalions in the trenches as they heard the telltale roar of falling masonry. The enemy guns on the Kashmir bastion were silenced at last, the shattered embrasures graphic evidence of the effect of the British salvos. With the rebels' counterfire defeated, the gunners turned their attention to the walls themselves. Baird Smith and his engineers had the artillerymen working on creating 2 huge breaches, one near the Kashmir bastion, the other near the Jumna River close to the water bastion. Day by day they ground away at the walls, shot after shot slamming into the stonework, the heavy guns picking at the face of the wall. They would continue to fire until the wall had fallen. With luck, or what the engineers would claim was careful planning, the rubble would fall outwards, creating a rocky pathway for the assault troops to clamber up. It would be down to Baird Smith to declare when the pair of breaches was practical. When, in his judgment, the infantry would be able to swarm up the fallen masonry and take their rifles and bayonets against the enemy on the other side of the wall. For Jack, the days blurred into one. He trailed in Nicholson's wake, attending meeting after meeting with the engineers and the commanders of the various battalions that would make up the attack. Occasionally they would meet with Hodson, the awkward conversations only lasting long enough for the intelligence officer to impart his latest reports on the enemy's numbers. On other matters, Hodson held his tongue. Jack's presence at the meetings left unremarked, his official place in Hodson's horse, at least temporarily, forgotten. Every few hours Nicholson would make the long, tiresome walk to the ridge's summit and scrutinize the city, always planning, always assessing the damage that had been inflicted, and wondering how long it would take to create the massive breaches in the walls that he would need if he were to get his infantry inside. Standing at Nicholson's side as the general plotted the city's demise, Jack forced himself to be patient. The agony of waiting was now nearly unbearable, but as the stones fell and the masonry crumbled, he felt his hopes begin to rise. In a matter of days, the British would finally be in a position to assault the Mughal emperor's capital and put an end to the rebellion that had torn the country apart. Jack watched the British batteries as they fired. He was far enough away to be able to observe them in relative peace. Great jets of flame rippled down the lines, the flashes searing through the darkness as the cannon fired in ordered salvos. The hollow boom was followed quickly by the dull thump as the shot hit the walls of the city. It made for a mesmerizing display, and Jack was quite captivated. "Mr. Lark! This way!" Jack started. He had been staring at the guns for too long. The harsh whisper interrupted his thoughts, and he forced his mind back to the task at hand. The shadowy forms of the two lieutenants of engineers were moving away from him with surprising speed. With them went the ensign and his small detachment from the 60th Rifles. The last man in the small column had turned and called to the officer from the staff that Nicholson had insisted accompany the party. "You'll be left behind if you ain't careful, sir." The darkened face of the rearmost rifleman creased into a smile as he seized the opportunity to berate an officer. It was close to midnight on the 5th day of the bombardment. This was the 3rd time Jack had crept close to the walls of Delhi. The first had been with Hodson, on a reconnaissance not dissimilar to this one. The second had ended in the vicious fight that had led to the loss of the woman he had come to love. The thought of Armourer made Jack's head turn to the walls only a few hundred yards away. He was close to her now, and the notion scratched at his mind. There was enough moonlight for him to see by, and he scanned the walls, the false hope that he would somehow spot a secret way in refusing to die away. "Careful, sir." A warning hand to his chest brought him up short. He saw the scowl on the face of the rifleman as the man wondered at the inept staff officer who had been forced upon them. Fucking officers. Jack chose to ignore the whispered verdict and shook his head, trying to clear his mind and concentrate on the task at hand. "Where are the engineers?" He asked the question, aware that he should have known the answer himself. "Just up front, sir." The tone of the rifleman's voice told Jack just how he was regarded. With an effort of will, he forced all thoughts of Armourer from his mind. "What's your name?" "Smithers." The rifleman spat as he gave his name. Jack nodded, then pushed his way through the crouching column of men, keeping low so as not to alert the sentries on the wall. It did not take long to reach the officers who waited at the head of the column, the 3 anxious faces turning as one as he approached. "What are we waiting for?" Jack did not know if he was the most senior officer, but he did not care. He had endured enough sneaking around. "We are assessing the breach." The blonde lieutenant from the 60th Rifles sounded as bored as Jack. The two shared a look of understanding. It was clear it was not the infantryman who was delaying proceedings. "Well?" Jack asked the question of the 2 engineer officers, who were studying the breach through field glasses new enough for Jack to be able to smell the sheen of protective oil. "I cannot tell." Lang, the taller of the 2, put down his glasses. "We are too far away." Jack did not care for the look of distaste that flickered across Lang's proud features. "Well then, Lieutenant, we had better get you closer." He turned to face the rifle officer. "I will take 6 of your men. Make sure that Rifleman Smithers is among them." He gave his orders clearly. The rifle lieutenant nodded his head in agreement, then turned away and began issuing his own commands in a harsh whisper. "What do you need to know?" Jack snapped the question at Lang. "We need to measure the breach to ensure it is practical. And we must tell the General whether the men will need ladders to climb out of the ditch or to scale the breach." Lang swallowed hard as he answered. "And how do you propose to do that?" "We have this, sir." The younger of the two engineer officers, Lieutenant Medley, held up a thin rod marked out in feet and inches. It must have been close to the height of two men, and Medley's face was flushed from having to carry it forward. "And we brought a ladder too, just to be sure." Jack shook his head. Both officers had only arrived with the siege train. Neither had been sullied by the long siege. "Well then, gentlemen, we had better go take a look-see. Are your men ready?" He addressed the question to the hard-faced rifle officer, who was failing to hide his amusement. "Sergeant Osmond, are you ready?" "Sir." A squat man with the bright white chevrons of a sergeant answered. Jack looked the squad over, pleased to see the scowling face of Rifleman Smithers in its midst. Two of the men carried the engineer's ladder. "Right, let's go." Jack did not wait. He moved forward into the darkness. The job of measuring the breaches had to be done. It was one of the last obstacles to be cleared before the final assault could be planned. He glanced once at the huge walls before focusing his attention on not losing his footing. He would see the job done properly. He would not allow the assault to be delayed. "Down you go, Lang. Quietly now. Sergeant Osmond, give me Smithers and one other man and keep the rest here." Jack gave his orders, speaking softly now that they were barely 200 yards from the breach the gunners had gouged in the wall. He had led the men up the glacis, the huge mound of earth that screened the lowest reaches of the wall, and to the very brink of the deep ditch that protected the Kashmir bastion and would form a dreadful obstacle to the men who would be attacking the breach. Lang slipped down into the ditch whilst Medley waited at the top. "Pass down the rod." The ditch was so deep they could barely hear Lang. Medley set the long rod on the ground and slid it down into the darkness. "Got it." "Very good. Right, let's go." Jack followed the rod, sliding down into the depths. It was deeper than he'd thought, the drop at least 16 feet, and he hit the bottom with a thump that jarred his bones. Muffled grunts and a single groan told him the rest of the small party had found the descent similarly painful. The sound of wood thudding into the thick layer of mud in the bottom of the ditch told him the ladder had made it too. The ditch was not very wide, but the far bank was at least as high as the one they had just dropped down. Jack shuddered as he imagined what it would be like when the assault was unleashed, the enemy on the wall able to fire down into the depths. It would be a slaughter yard, the mushy ground beneath his feet certain to be swamped in a river of blood. But there was no other way to reach the breach, and so the British soldiers would simply have to endure and get to the other side, no matter how many of them were shot down. "I rather think the question of ladders is now answered." The high-pitched voice of Lieutenant Medley made the announcement to the groans of the two riflemen, whose feelings on the final stage of the night's expedition were clear. "Be quiet," Jack snapped to the two men, who immediately fell silent. "Mr. Medley," his tone was curt and sarcastic, "I suggest you keep your voice down and go and measure the damn breach." "Yes, sir." Medley looked as if he were more terrified of the grim-faced staff officer who had been assigned to the party by General Nicholson himself than he was of the thousands of mutineers who waited just a few yards away. He bobbed his head once before he scurried to Lang's side, his knuckles showing white as he gripped the unwieldy measuring pole. "Bring the ladder over here." Lang gave the order with some authority. Jack was impressed by his calm demeanour. The two riflemen shared a look before lifting the ladder from the mud and hauling it to the opposite side of the ditch. "Smithers, you go up first." Jack had followed them over and now gave an order of his own, one that he expected to be obeyed. "Sir?" Smithers looked like Jack was ordering him to feast on a turd. "You heard me. Next time you offer an opinion of an officer, make sure he doesn't hear you." Smithers looked back at him with a mix of surprise and disgust. But there was no point in delaying. He slung his rifle round his shoulder before spitting once, then wiping his muddy hands on the flanks of the trousers. With a final angry glance at Jack, he took hold of the ladder and started to climb. "You stay here." Jack jabbed a finger at the other rifleman, who could not help but grin as he realized he was the luckier of the two men assigned to the three officers. "Lang, you next." It did not take long for Lang and Medley to join Smithers on the top of the ditch. Jack followed them. The sight that greeted him took his breath away. He had stood with Nicholson and watched as the siege guns hammered away at the walls, yet nothing he had witnessed prepared him for the destruction that he now saw. The breach was huge. Vast mountains of broken stone stretched out in front of him, littering the ground in front of the wall. The slope of the breach itself had been pounded into dust so that it looked more like gritty sand than solid stone. Obstacles placed there by the rebels lay broken and torn amidst the ruins, the relentless British gunners pounding the breach even though the wall had fallen, keeping it clear and ready for the infantry who would be thrown against it. "Off you go, gentlemen. And I would look lively if I were you. I doubt the damn pandies will take kindly to us poking around here for long." The two lieutenants needed no urging. They scrambled forward, hunching low as if that would somehow screen their progress from the eyes of any sentries on the walls that still stood either side of the breach. The engineer officers reached the bottom of the slope of rubble. It was crucial they measure the height of the final barrier to the assault. If the threshold was too high, the attacking columns would need more ladders just to reach the breach. If the gunners had done their job right, it would be low enough for the men to scramble up unaided. It was the last piece of detailed information the commanders needed to be able to order the assault. Jack watched the two officers at work. He was impressed by their calm manner. They were either brave young men, or they had no idea how much danger they were in. As he watched, Lang dropped the measuring rod and used his hands to haul himself up to the slope. It was the final confirmation. The breach was practical. The sound of the first musket firing was startling as it ripped through the silence. It was followed by the roar of the sentries as they spotted a red-jacketed British officer sitting as bold as brass on the base of the fallen wall. "Shit!" Jack cursed. "Shoot the fuckers!" He snapped the order at Smithers before he dashed forward. He did not bother to crouch. The time for circumspection was over. "Get back here now, you fools!" he shouted at the two young officers, waving his arm to emphasize the command. Lang and Medley did not need to be told twice. Shots kicked up puffs of dust all around them, the closest sentries blazing away at the fast-moving figures. Jack saw more rebels starting to appear at the top of the breach. They were running forward, sliding and careering down the rubble path as they tried to reach the British officers who had the temerity to wander so close. "Run! Shit!" Jack flinched as Smithers opened fire. The rifleman had taken his time, and Jack heard the grunt of satisfaction as a single enemy sepoy crumpled to the ground, an Enfield bullet punched into his guts. "Go! Go!" Jack was moving fast now. He pushed Smithers away, letting him go first. He turned when he reached the top of the ladder. "Come on!" he urged the two officers to hurry. "Drop the damn rod!" he bellowed at Medley, who was still clutching the measuring tool. He felt the first stirrings of fear. He did not want to die, not here, not when the assault was close. The idea of falling at the final hurdle was nearly more than he could bear, and he had to force himself to remain still and wait for the pair of subalterns rather than turn and leap into the safety of the ditch. The air was alive with the whip and crack of passing bullets, and Jack could not help but flinch as he sensed shot after shot whispering past. "Jump!" He shouted the final order as the two lieutenants raced towards him. To their credit, they did not stop. Both threw themselves over the edge and into the ditch, and he heard the twin thumps as their bodies hit the bottom. He took one last look at the city. He would not be this close to Armourer again until the day of the assault. A ragged volley crashed out, the rebel sepoys starting to bring some order to their chaotic reaction to the arrival of the British party. It missed, not one shot coming close enough for Jack to feel its passing, yet it was a final confirmation that it was time to go. He turned and scrambled down the ladder. It would not be long now until he could return. Chapter 36. "Gentlemen, your attention, please." Nicholson looked round the tent. It was late afternoon, and the officers from the 75th Foot, the 1st Bengal Fusiliers, and the 2nd Punjab Infantry were crammed into the confined space, their flushed and sweaty faces riveted on the general. It was unbearably hot, the air ripe with the smell of bodies and sun-warmed canvas. Yet not one officer cared about the discomfort. Nicholson was revealing the plan for the great assault on Delhi, and none of them wanted to be anywhere else. "We go at dawn." Nicholson spoke softly. He stood at the campaign table at the centre of the tent. It was covered with hastily drawn sketches and page after page of lists and orders. He leant forward, both arms braced on the desk, and looked into every face, searching the eyes of his senior officers as if assessing their worth one final time. The men knew each other well, and they glanced at one another, the tent filled with the tense air of expectation. "General Wilson has placed me in overall command," Nicholson continued, keeping his voice low. "I shall divide the army into 5 columns. 4 committed to the assault on the city, 1 held back in reserve. I shall take the 1st column. As you may have already been able to conclude, your 3 batteries will form that column. Brigadier Jones has the 2nd column, Colonel Campbell the 3rd, Major Reed the 4th, and Brigadier Longfield the 5th. Brigadier Grant will command the cavalry, and Colonel Dennis of the 52nd will take charge of the encampment. All 4 of the attacking columns will have a detachment from the 60th to act as skirmishers, and we shall all be joined by men from the engineers." Jack stood at the back of the tent and listened to the plan of attack. He was tired, the strain of the previous night's reconnaissance making itself felt in the ache deep in his back. The logistics of the columns and their commanders meant little to him. All he cared about was that they were finally going. The weeks of waiting were coming to an end. "Each of the 4 assault columns has its own objective. Our column will attack the breach made in the Kashmir Bastion, with the 2nd column going for the breach made in the face of the Water Bastion. Colonel Campbell's column will attack the Kashmir Gate itself. 2 officers of engineers will accompany them with orders to blow the gate, so don't be surprised when there is a big bang." Nicholson smiled as he saw the grins on the faces of his audience. "The 4th column under Major Reed will do the same at the Kabul Gate. Brigadier Grant and his cavalry will remain in reserve. Once we are through the breach, we are to clear the Shah Bastion before moving on to take the remains of the Mori. When that is secure, we shall push on and take the Kabul Gate. There we shall join with Major Reed's column and strike for the Lahore." Nicholson looked round the room, checking that his officers understood the plan. "We will go into details shortly, but we can be assured that we do God's work. We cannot fail." The whole Empire is looking to us. We shall not let them down. Jack held Nicholson's glare when it rested on his face. The general was holding back his passion, yet Jack could see the wild glint in his eye as he outlined the plan he had formed. The assault is to commence at 3 a.m., Nicholson resumed his briefing, his voice as deadpan as when he had started. Our initial objective, gentlemen, is the breach in the face of the Kashmir bastion. The engineers have assured me that it is practical, and my own aide went forward to make sure that that is indeed the case. A murmur of approval went around the room. A few faces turned to glance at Jack, but he refused to catch anyone's eye and stared resolutely at Nicholson. The first obstacle we face is a ditch across the face of the bastion. It is around 16 feet deep and 25 feet wide. Your men will be issued with scaling ladders to climb the far face. You must keep them moving. They will be sorely tempted to stay in the ditch, but they cannot be allowed to pause. Is that clear? Again there was a murmur of voices. There was a strange assortment of men in the tent, considering Nicholson had assembled the commanders of his first column. The 3 battalions were light on men and even lighter on officers. The 75th was still commanded by its lieutenant colonel, but its second in command was a captain called Brooks, and it could barely muster 300 soldiers fit for duty. The 1st Bengal Fusiliers under Major Jacob were in an even worse condition, the battalion numbering just 250 men, barely 3 companies' worth of soldiers. The strongest battalion in the column would be the 2nd Punjab Infantry, who could boast 450 men in its ranks, though it was led by a mere captain called Green, the rest of its senior officers sick, dead, or assigned elsewhere. It was a threadbare column of men who would lead the assault on Delhi. Once in the breach, we will divide. Nicholson's voice was quickening as he gave more details of the plan, his passion growing. The 2nd Punjab and the 75th will incline to the left and escalade the left-hand side of the bastion through the breach. The 1st Bengal Fusiliers will incline right and take the right-hand side of the breach. I shall go to the left, so Major Jacobs, you will be able to fight without my interference. Nicholson managed to force out a smile as the faintest chuckle went around the room at the comment. Once through the breach, we will reform. The 2nd column will have fought through the breach, and together we will press on towards the Kabul gate, where Major Reed's column should be ready to meet us. Nicholson stood back from the table. The enemy will be unable to mount much resistance. The gunners have obliterated their covering bastions and will keep up their fire until we are in place to attack. The officers nodded their understanding, and Nicholson offered them a thin smile. We have reached the moment we have waited for. God is with us. How can we lose? Jack kept silent as the officers began to talk amongst themselves. He had listened carefully to the plan, and he admired the general's certainty, but he knew it meant little. Once the lead started to fly, the plan would go to hell in a basket. It would be down to the officers to lead the men, to carry the attack when every instinct would urge them to find cover. Nicholson's column would be forced into the funnel of the breach. The men would be packed together into one compact mass, unable to return any enemy fire. The British would be forced to swamp the breach with numbers, overwhelming the enemy with so many targets that they simply could not kill them fast enough. It was a brutal way to wage war, and the casualties would be terrible. He pushed through the crowd and left the command tent, suddenly keen for fresh air. Nicholson spoke of plans and strategy, but Jack knew they were wasted words. The assault would only succeed if the men were willing to endure the slaughter for long enough to force a passage into the city. It would be down to the poor bloody infantry to win through and give Nicholson the victory he craved. Jack sat on a stool inside his tent. His revolver lay on the ground in front of him, each piece carefully cleaned, the 5 loaded chambers now sealed with their thin layer of grease. Fred Roberts sat at his side, carefully going through his own ritual to prepare him for battle. Neither spoke, each sensitive to the other's need for peace. Lark? The silence was shattered by the loud, braying voice that Jack had come to know so well. Would you like me to tell him you are indisposed? Roberts made the offer softly, a wry smile on his face as he too recognized the hectoring tones of Lieutenant Hodson. Jack sighed. No, I'll speak to him, but thank you. He got to his feet, his hands quickly going to the small of his back. He had sat still for too long, and the pit of his spine was hurting like the very devil. He tried to massage away the worst of the pain as he walked out of the tent to see what Hodson wanted. Ah, there you are, you damn blackguard. Hodson had been pacing back and forth outside the small tent that Jack now shared with Roberts. His large, pale face was flushed, and he had a wild look about the eyes. What do you want? Jack no longer felt the need to address Hodson as Sir. I have heard you are fully abandoning my command. I wish to know if this is the truth. I'm to serve with General Nicholson. I've been taken on to his staff. Jack gasped as his probing fingers pressed against a nerve and sent a spasm of pain searing down his legs. So you leave your place of duty the night before battle? Hodson relished the pompous phrasing. I have not left the army. I have left you. Hodson's mouth worked furiously as he chewed on air. You are making a mistake. He took a pace forward, and for a moment Jack thought he might lash out. But fighting was not Hodson's style. I promise you, Jack Lark, I shall not forget this slight. You do yourself no favours. When this is over, you will rue the day you made this decision. I doubt it. Why, you damned cur! I think you forget who you're speaking to. If I'm a damned cur, then you should be glad to see me go. Jack did not understand Hodson's desire for him to return to the ranks of the plungers. Hodson pulled back sharply. He looked at the ground, then at the sky, anywhere but at Jack. I need you. The words were said so quietly that Jack could barely hear them. I beg your pardon? I need you, damn it! Hodson shouted now, specks of spittle flung from his lips with the force of the admission. I want you to fight with me, there! Now do you understand? He looked back at the ground, his discomfort obvious. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. You are good in battle. I would have you at my side. Jack laughed. I thought you wanted all the glory for yourself. I cannot fight like you. Hodson squirmed at the admission. You are one of the very best I have ever seen. It was Jack's turn to feel uncomfortable. He was surprised by Hodson's confession. It felt odd to have two officers arguing over his services. He was a boy from the rookeries of London, yet now two of the most famous officers in the army were both requesting that he fight with them. For a moment he almost felt sorry for Hodson, but then he remembered his treatment of the wounded sepoy after the affair at Badli-ki-Sarai, and he remembered Nicholson leading the men from the front as they stormed the Sarai at Najafgarh. You do not need me, and I shall not rejoin your command. Jack spoke firmly. He did not flinch as he delivered the statement, meeting Hodson's pale blue eyes with calm detachment. Hodson stared at him for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. So be it. I shall not forget this. After the battle you will wish you had chosen otherwise. He said nothing else before he walked away. Jack turned and went back into the tent to finish preparing his revolver. He did not care what Hodson thought of him. Nothing mattered any more. For Jack, there was no future to think on, no after the battle to consider. There was only the assault. Chapter 37. The oil lamp flickered, its thin light casting shadows on Fred Roberts's face as he lifted the sheet of paper closer so he could read the sloping script that swirled across the page. It was a little after midnight, and the men were assembling in the 4 columns that would launch the assault on the great city they had watched for so many weeks and months. The camp had been stripped bare of every man capable of fighting, the need to fill the columns taking precedence over the security of the encampment. The least sick men had been forced from the hospital tents and returned to duty so as not to leave the British lines completely unmanned. It was a risk, yet it was as nothing compared to the greater risk of the assault itself. In total, just fewer than 10,000 men had been declared fit for duty. It was more than the British generals had hoped of putting into the field, but still less than 1/3 of the best estimate of the enemy's strength. Jack and Roberts were talking to each of the 3 battalions in Nicholson's column in turn, addressing the final orders to the officers who had assembled to hear them. They had started with the 75th, the men who had led the assault at Badli-Ki-Sarai all those months before. As Roberts began to speak, a heavy-bodied moth battered itself against the glass lantern, the sound of the impacts adding a soft staccato rhythm to his words. Any officer or man who might be wounded is to be left where he falls. Men are forbidden from stepping from the ranks to offer aid or assistance. There will be dolis and litters for the wounded, and they will be taken away once the assault is successful. Jack paid the final instructions for the assault little heed. He had heard them before. Roberts had insisted on reading them aloud to practice his delivery, an act that spoke of his attention to detail and his determination to master everything he was asked to do. Neither officer had slept in the hours that had passed since Hodson had left them. They had sat in their tent, talking little, each alone with his thoughts and his fear. There will be no plundering. All prizes will be put aside into common stock for fair division at a later date. No prisoners are to be made. Care must be taken to ensure that no woman or child is injured. Jack smiled. He sensed Nicholson's presence in the words and can well imagine the general sitting at his campaign table scribbling out the dull, dry phrases. He knew there was little hope of the orders being obeyed. If the assault was successful, the men would see the city as theirs. Theft would be rife, the soldiers' quick finger likely to pocket anything that caught their eye. Some might obey and return their plunder, but only if it was too big to carry. Gentlemen, I am to request that you swear on your swords to abide by these orders. The officers walked forward, their stern faces grim in the flickering light of the lantern. One by one they drew their steel blades and swore to obey the orders, and to make sure their men did the same. Jack watched the scene with detachment. The waiting was picking at his nerves. He wanted it to be over, and he willed the time to pass. The final hours were dragging by so slowly that he felt like the night had already lasted for several days. He made an oath of his own. He would survive the assault, and he would discover Armourer's fate, or he would die in the attempt. Thank you, gentlemen. Fred Roberts folded the orders carefully before sliding them into a pocket. His face was flushed, and Jack wondered what thoughts were swirling around in the young officer's head. They had passed many hours together, but they had shared little of themselves. Roberts cleared his throat as the final officer sheathed his sword. Thank you, gentlemen. Father Bertrand will speak to you now. I wish you all the best. He took a step to one side to usher forward the clergyman who would bless the battalion. See you in the city. He flashed the commander of the 75th a quick smile before turning to Jack, motioning with his head for them to move on so they could repeat the process at the next battalion. Then there would be nothing to do but wait. The 2 men had finished addressing the officers of the 2nd Punjab Infantry and had begun to make their way back to Nicholson's command tent, when Roberts suddenly stopped and fixed Jack with an earnest expression. "I say, Jack, would you keep this for me?" He thrust a small envelope towards Jack, his expression betraying the awkwardness of the gesture. "What is it?" Jack did not lift his hand to take it. "A note for my mother. You know, just in case." Jack scowled. "You can keep it yourself. I'll just lose it." "Please. It would set my mind at ease knowing that you had it." Roberts offered it again, pushing it towards Jack's hand. Jack took it reluctantly and thrust it into his pocket. "It's foolish nonsense. I'll give it back to you afterwards." Roberts said nothing. He was looking at Jack intently. "I have a feeling this is the last we shall see of each other. I wish we had had time to get to know each other better." He thrust out his hand. "Thank you, Jack." Jack did his best not to scowl. He gave the earnest young officer's hand a quick shake. "You sound like an old woman. Keep your mind on what is to be done and forget all this nonsense." He heard the tetchy tone in his own voice, and he did not care. He had deliberately kept his distance from Roberts. There was a great deal to admire in the young man. Once Jack would have warmed to him, seeking out a friendship to stave off his loneliness. But he had done that before, and it had cost him dearly. Subalterns had a habit of dying in battle. Jack would rather be alone than risk getting close to another boy dressed as an officer who would not make it through the next few days. Jack stood alone. The column would shortly be ordered to form up, and the men sat on the ground whilst their officers grouped together, sharing a last moment of company with their fellows before returning to their lonely posts. The closest group guffawed loudly at a weak jest, their humour used as a thin armour against their fears. The men sat quietly and fiddled with their weapons and their equipment, getting everything ready as they prepared for the assault. It was the last hour, the Hawar Khana, the breathing of the air, the silent time of superstitious ritual and prayer. For the hour of death was drawing near, and no man could approach what might be the last moments of his life without fear in his heart. "Do you think they know that we're coming?" Roberts asked the question softly as he wandered close to Jack's isolated station. Jack saw the young officer's hand clenched around his sword's hilt, then release. The gesture was repeated time after time, an indication of tension barely controlled. "The enemy are no fools, so yes, I would expect they do." "The guns will fire until the last possible moment. That should keep the breaches clear." "It should." Once Jack would have tried to allay the younger man's fears, but that was before he had lost armourer. His mind was in turmoil. As the time for the assault finally approached, he tortured himself more and more with thoughts of what might have happened to her. The barriers he had constructed around such dreadful imaginings were failing as the time for knowing the truth came closer. He just wanted to go. "It's time to trust to God, then." Roberts did not notice Jack's reluctance to speak. "Have you enough water?" Jack patted the bottle that hung around his neck on a thin leather strap. "I do." He looked at Roberts and flashed a humourless smile. "I am ready." Roberts smiled back. "I don't think I am. But I don't expect that will matter to anyone now." The smile vanished. "We must all do our duty." Jack met Roberts's stare. He recognized the younger man's fear. He turned away and looked at the great city. He had told the truth. He was ready. The columns moved off shortly after 3 a.m. They marched past the Flagstaff Tower and then down from the ridge, moving quickly through the ruins on its eastern flank before taking up position in the gardens of Hindu Rao's house. In the twisted remains of the once beautiful space, a few resilient plants clung to life, a tantalizing glimpse of what had been here before the wanton destruction of the siege had laid waste to the land around the city. The British guns fired without pause. The men in the columns heading for the Kashmir Gate and the breaches in the closest bastion could see the flames that leapt from the barrels as the huge siege weapons pounded away at the city, the gunners finding the strength for one last effort, one last barrage before their job was done, and the battle became the responsibility of the men who marched with loaded rifles and bared bayonets. Every few minutes the enemy threw up a star shell, illuminating the ridge and the marching columns, the sudden light making the infantrymen flinch as their progress was revealed to the sentries on the walls of the city. There was no hope of surprise. The enemy would know the British were coming. The days of incessant barrage like the overture at the start of an operetta, a tantalizing taste of what was to come in the main act that would follow. The first 3 columns marched into position, then formed up, the ranks tight and ordered. Still the artillery hammered away, the thunderous crash of round shots smashing into the thick walls, deafening the infantry, who were now close to the city. The first smudge of dawn lit up the far horizon, and the guns fell silent. The infantry waited for the order to go. In the sudden quiet, a few foolhardy birds started to sing, greeting the approach of dawn, unaware of the slaughter that would come with the first rays of the sun. Jack loosened his sabre in its scabbard and made sure the buckle on his holster was undone. His nose twitched as he smelt the delicate fragrance of orange blossom and roses over the reek of sulphur and the bitter taint of powder smoke. He had not smelt anything so sweet for as long as he could remember, and he savoured the delicate aroma. It was a link to another world, a place where men could think of a future counted in more than minutes. The tranquillity swallowed the column, an exquisite moment that had men staring at each other wide-eyed in surprise. "Advance!" The peace was shattered as the order was given. The bugles called, the rising notes goading the packed ranks into action. With a roar and a cheer, the 3 columns surged forward. The assault on Delhi had begun. Chapter 38. Jack ran hard, his breath roaring in his ears. The men of the column surged along behind him. They ran in silence, the cheer that had marked the start of the attack replaced by the grunts and pants of men saving themselves for what was to come. 50 yards of no man's land separated them from the ditch in front of the breach, yet it felt like 1,000. The ground crawled past under Jack's boots. Time passed with cruel slowness, each step taking an age. He pumped his legs, urging them to greater speed, striving to cross the open ground before the enemy could open fire. Nicholson ran at his side, leading the men of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers, the foremost battalion in the 1st column. They ascended the glacis that led to the ditch, their progress marked only by the sound of boots slamming into the ground and equipment thumping and jangling against fast-moving bodies. There were no red coats on display that day. The men of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers were attacking in their dirty grey flannel coats, with black handkerchiefs knotted around their necks, their fine black shakos replaced with forage caps covered in white cloth. They might not have looked like the famous red-coated infantrymen of old, but they were still redcoats. They went forward with their bayonets locked tight to the barrels of their Enfield rifles, the vicious steel that had won the British Army 1,000 victories on 100 foreign fields, held ready to take revenge on the former soldiers of the Queen who had dared to turn against their masters. The first hard yards ground past. The men in the attacking column saw the ditch, its great black maw drawing them in. Jack focused his attention on the jump he would have to make. He feared he would break an ankle, his assault ending in an ignominious heap in the mud at the bottom of the ditch. He did not look at the ranks of enemy troops that flowed down the face of the breach, now that the British guns could no longer fire for fear of hitting their own men. The men of the 60th Rifles were in front of the column in a skirmish line. The fastest of them were already reaching the edge of the ditch, and Jack saw them slow as they prepared to plunge into the darkness. The enemy opened fire. The air was alive with a hailstorm of musket balls. Jack flinched as one seared past his head, yet still he pounded forward, forcing his legs to carry him into danger when any sane man would have sought shelter from the wicked fire. The first men fell. A rifleman spun around, his hands clutched to the ruins of his face. Others merely crumpled, their bodies folding over as the enemy shot found its mark in their guts. Jack heard the awful, meaty slap of bullets hitting flesh. Some men shrieked as they fell, explosive cries of agony and surprise as their hopes of surviving the day were lost in the opening moments of the assault. "Forward!" Nicholson roared the command. The general had drawn his sword, and now he brandished it aloft, turning to face his men even as he ran, his mouth stretched wide as he bellowed the encouragement for them to follow his lead. The men pressed on. The fallen were ignored, their pitiful cries callously left behind as the column surged forward. The enemy poured on the fire, striking down dozens, the balls coming so fast that it seemed impossible that any man would be able to reach the ditch unscathed. Jack ran on. He could do nothing else. Even as the fire flashed past, he went forward, his arm lifting instinctively to screen his face, as though he was walking into a storm rather than the deadly volleys that were gutting the column's leading ranks. Dozens of men lay scattered on the ground, their shattered bodies stretched out, their blood staining the dusty soil. The main body of the column could not avoid them, and heavy boots crushed the ruined flesh. Jack reached the edge of the ditch. He had seen some of the riflemen pause, going to their knees so that they could lower themselves into the darkness, but he had been there before, and he ran hard before leaping out and into the ditch without pause. His stomach lurched as he fell through the air, and he hit the ground hard. He stumbled, his boots slipping in the muck, and careered into a rifleman, his head bouncing off the man's back. Yet the infantryman seemed not to notice as he rushed away, intent on reaching the far side of the ditch. More and more bodies thumped down around Jack. Men cursed as elbows and knees punched into their flesh. Then the crowd surged forward, making room for the men who were still piling down, those still on the lip desperate to get into the supposed safety of the dark, dank ditch. But the ditch was no safe haven. The enemy in the breach could not fire directly into it, but those high on the walls and on the bastions could. They poured down their fire, striking scores of men to the ground, the bodies falling to tangle around the boots of those still trying to press on. It was chaos. Jack was jostled, men clawing at each other in a desperate race to get to the shelter of the far bank. An elbow drove into his gut, the bright flash of pain goading him on. He went forward, caught up in the rush, powerless against the surging forces of the mob. "Where are the ladders?" The despairing cry echoed around the ditch. Men were reaching the far side only to be met with a wall of damp earth. The crowd was surging around, some trying to push backwards in a desperate search for the ladders, whilst others were pressing forward, the animal instinct of the mob certain that there was safety in moving on. The enemy in the breach crowded forward, hurtling stones and broken masonry into the ditch, the rocks shattering the skulls of the unlucky souls they hit. The rebels on the walls fired shot after shot until the bottom of the ditch was running with streams of blood. Jack was helpless. He was wedged in tight, bodies pressed all around him. He tried to turn, but he was caught fast. The mob surged forwards, its number swelling as more and more men leapt into the press of bodies at the bottom of the ditch. Voices lifted in panic. Still the enemy fired, knocking more men to the ground, their animal shrieks of horror drowning out the demands for the ladders. It was like shooting rats in a barrel, and the rebels could not miss. A spray of hot blood slicked across Jack's face. With his arms pinned at his sides, he could not use them to wipe the gruesome offal away, and it dribbled to his mouth, the tang of blood in his nostrils and its salty taste on his lips. The man in front of Jack had been hit. The musket ball had ripped through the crown of his undress hat and pierced his brain. He fell fast, dropping like a stone. But Jack felt nothing but a surge of joy at finally having room to breathe, the momentary respite from the crush meaning more than the death of a man he had never known. A sharp blow hammered into his spine, nearly knocking him from his feet. He was shoved to one side, his rank of no consequence in the horror of the ditch. "Get out of the fucking way!" A rifleman spat the words into Jack's face as he staggered past, clutching one of the precious ladders. "Make way!" Jack understood at once and grabbed at the ladder, taking hold and inching it forward, adding his strength and his voice to the men trying to force a passage in the melee. "Move!" They shoved their way through the press of bodies, their curses drowned out by the screams of men as they were hit. They used the ladder as a battering ram, bludgeoning a path towards the far side of the ditch, their task only made easier when the enemy shot struck down the men in their way. Step by step, they burrowed through the press of bodies until they reached the far side. The men carrying the ladder immediately rammed the front of it into the base of the ditch's side. They had raised it in seconds. "Me first!" Jack was bellowing at the rifleman, his hands reaching for the ladder like a greedy child. But the men who had fought to drag it forward pushed him out of the way, and he was forced to stand aside as their heavy boots thumped into the rungs. "Out of the way!" Jack could wait no longer. He shouted the words into the face of a rifleman before using his shoulder to barge his way onto the ladder. He climbed fast. The ladder's rungs were rough, and he felt the stab of pain as a splinter tore at his palm. He had a moment to curse his foolishness. He had not thought to draw his weapons, so he was scaling the ladder with his hands empty, rushing towards the enemy without the means to fight back. He reached the top and threw himself from the top rung and began to run. Barely a dozen riflemen were with him, but he did not care. "Follow me!" He drew his sword as he charged forward, the steel whispering out of the scabbard, the blade coming alive in his hand. The riflemen heard him. They stormed after him with a will, yelling like fiends released from hell. The breach was packed with the enemy. Not all were rebel sepoys. Many were civilians, the braver elements in the city come to defend their freedom. Others were jihadis. Countless heads lined the walls above the breach, with dozens of muskets aimed down at the men breaking free of the ditch. Jack saw the dark faces under bright pagdies, their mouths twisted into dreadful grimaces as they fired and fired at the men who came to reclaim their lost kingdom. The British soldiers went forward like a pack of hounds released to the kill. They were cheering now, their horror and rage unleashed. More and more men were escaping from the hell of the ditch, and they swarmed after the leading troops, rushing up the easy slope of the breach, keening for blood. The enemy fired and fired, every shot finding a home in flesh, but still the British infantry came on, ignoring the men falling around them. Cannon opened fire on the attack. Shells whistled through the air, the explosions bursting in bright fountains of colour that scythed men from their feet. Another cannon had been sighted at the top of the breach, and now it opened fire with canister. The first blast cut deep into the leading ranks, but still the assault went forward, the men from the first column swamping the breach with more men than the enemy could kill. Jack stayed silent as he ran up the slope, dashing through the explosions. All around him men were dying, their bodies littering the ground. Yet he could do nothing but go forward, lurching on despite being certain that he would be hit. A shell smashed into the ground 6 yards to his front. The ground lurched, a fountain of broken stone lifted high into the air. The shockwave battered against him, his body hit by a spray of splinters. Yet somehow he kept his footing, and he roared in anger, releasing the terror before running on. The enemy in the breach began to flee, clawing away from the point of the assault. But some were slow, and the British soldiers caught them as they tried to escape. With a dreadful keening, the bayonets were rammed forward. They punched into enemy flesh, ripping huge holes in the bodies of the men trying to evade the attackers' wrath. The redcoats finally had a target for their rage, and they were merciless as they cut down every man they could find. The first men were reaching the top of the slope. Somehow enough had survived, and now they pressed on towards the huge gabions that lined the head of the breach. Jack followed a rifleman through a gap in the gabions. The far side was full of rebels, who now turned and thrust their bayonets at the British soldiers as they forced their way past the barricade. There was no time for fear. The rifleman to Jack's front fell, a bayonet piercing his neck. His despairing scream cut off as 6 blades ripped into his flesh. More bayonets reached for Jack. He battered aside one thrust at his guts before cutting his sword back in a desperate parry as another man aimed at his side. He felt the pressure at his back as men tried to follow him through the gap in the barricade. He slashed his sabre, cutting hard at the wall of bayonets in front of him, trying to force them to give ground. But the enemy stood firm, forming a rough line as they fought to hold the top of the breach. They had been well trained by their British masters, and the line tightened, the files standing shoulder to shoulder so that there were no gaps for the redcoats to exploit. More and more men were reaching the top of the breach. They forced their way through the gaps in the barricade, pressing into the backs of the men who faced the enemy line. Men screamed as they were pushed forward and driven onto the enemy's bayonets. Jack bellowed as he parried another bayonet and then another. He felt hands shoving at his back, and he tried to step back lest he too be thrust onto one of the dozens of bayonets to his front. But the pressure was relentless. He was thumped hard, fists pounding into him as men behind the barricade fought to get through and escape the wicked enemy fire that still scoured the breach. He could do nothing against such power, and he was forced forward, his boots sliding along the ground no matter how hard he tried to hold his place. He was about to die. In desperation, he threw away his sabre and went for his revolver. He jerked back hard into the bodies behind him, giving himself enough space to free the handgun from its holster. The gun lifted and he pulled the trigger, a bellow of sudden fear escaping his lips as he saw a bayonet coming straight for his throat. The heavy bullet hit the man between the eyes. The bayonet fell away and Jack roared in triumph. He changed his point of aim and fired at the next man in the line. He saw the bullet thump into the rebel's chest before he was propelled forward, helpless against the power of the men pushing up behind him. He fired again, even as he staggered over the bodies of those he had killed, cutting down more men in the wall, creating a gap in the line. The attackers went into the bloody opening in a heartbeat. They were merciless, surging past Jack, lunging at the flanks of the gap, going for the rebels who still faced forward. Attacked from the side, these men were defenceless, and the British soldiers cut them down, then stepped over the corpses and rammed their bayonets forward again, killing without pause. The enemy line broke. With a huge hole torn in its centre, the rebels could not stand, and they ran, their defiant defence ending in screams of terror. Jack snatched up the sword he had thrown down before bending double and sucking in huge lungfuls of air, fighting off the wave of terror that had surged through him as the fight ended. He had come so close to death. Yet somehow he had survived. The column had broken into the city. "Move on! Don't stop! Attack!" A huge voice urged the men on. Jack lifted his head and saw Nicholson striding through the bodies that littered the ground behind the Gabian barricade. "Jack! Don't damn well stand there lollygagging! To the ramparts, man!" The general roared past, leaving Jack staring at his back. The column had taken the breach, but they were still well short of their objectives. The fighting had barely begun. Chapter 39. Jack led the closest men onto the ramparts, following the path taken by many of the retreating rebels. He did not know where Nicholson had gone, but he knew enough of the plan to be aware that the first column had to fight their way along the ramparts and take the remains of the Mori bastion before moving on to assault the Kabul gate. He heard the roar of fighting as the other columns made their attacks, but he had little sense of anything outside his own small world. He turned and saw a few dozen men from the 1st Bengal Fusiliers trailing in his wake, following his lead. Many were bloodied, their bayonets covered with gore, but their faces betrayed their determination to get the job done. Jack might not have known the names of any of the men who followed him, but he was certain they would not let him down. "Follow me!" He thrust his empty revolver into his holster as he began to run. He felt the madness of the fight begin to take hold of his soul. He savoured the joy of leading men into battle, the familiar sensation building deep in his guts and forcing away his fear. The ramparts twisted and turned as they followed the shape of the wall. Every few yards there was an embrasure for a cannon. Each position was a natural barricade, and Jack knew that he had to keep his men moving and chasing hard after the enemy, never giving them a moment to turn and fight. "On! On!" His breath rasped as he urged the grey-coated men from the 1st Bengal Fusiliers to greater speed. They raced along the wall, bounding past a dozen embrasures, the enemy sprinting ahead. Jack saw many of the rebels glancing over their shoulders, tantalizing glimpses of faces that looked back in fear at the white-faced Farangi who charged after them. "Come on!" He scrambled past yet another cannon. The enemy appeared to be getting further away, their fear spurring them on. Jack's men were tiring, the hard yards they had already covered sapping their strength. Despite his best efforts, they were slowing, the attack losing its precious momentum. Then the enemy turned. With a great roar, the rebels faced the onrushing attackers. They had no time to reload, but they lined the rampart, thrusting their bayonets out, their voices raised in desperate anger as they found the courage to stand and fight. "Kill them!" Jack roared the order, and the men behind him cheered as they charged at the handful of rebels who dared to face them. Jack did not pause. He threw himself at the enemy, leading the rush, his sword raised high above his head as he bellowed his challenge at the gods. The distance closed in a heartbeat, the wild madness of the fight spurring him on. Then he hit the line. A dark face beneath a sky-blue pagdi screamed at him as he punched the man's bayonet aside. The scream turned to a shriek as Jack drove the tip of his sword forward, gouging through the man's neck and tearing away his throat. The man fell, and Jack kicked him to one side without compassion, his only thought to clear a path for his men. The Fusiliers he had led forward piled into the melee. Their bayonets worked furiously to clear the rampart, the wicked steel brutally effective at such close quarters. A man wearing a white kurta came at Jack with a tulwar. He had time to see the rust on the ancient blade before he battered it to one side. The weapon fell away and Jack stepped forward, slashing his sword upwards in a rising blow that cut up through the rebel's face. The man reeled away, the useless weapon falling to the ground. A Fusilier finished him with a bayonet to the heart. "Come on!" Jack was clear of the fight, and he roared at the men to follow him. He had to keep them moving. "Forward!" Another voice joined his, and he spied Lieutenant Lang, the engineer officer who had so bravely measured the breach. He had no idea what the officer was doing in the lead ranks of the assault, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Move!" Jack felt the madness taking control. It was the same soul-tearing fury that had driven him into so many fights. He was a god, a killer of men, and he ran forward, no longer caring whether the men followed or stayed behind. All that mattered was the urge to fight, to find more victims for his willing blade. He stormed along the rampart, Lieutenant Lang and the others trailing in his wake. Men from the other battalions in the first column had joined the Fusiliers on the wall. Nicholson's precious orders for the assault had been left behind in the slaughter in the breach. The men clung to whoever was closest, responding to the orders of whichever officer they could hear. Many followed the khaki-clad lieutenant who fought at their head, his right to command never doubted for a second. Jack flinched as a storm of musket balls seared through the air around him. He roared his war cry, the banshee wail released as he ran, the madness driving him into the vicious fire without thought. He hurtled around a bend in the rampart and saw the enemy ahead. They milled at the base of the next defensive tower, some frantically trying to reload, others taking up a position where they could form another wall of bayonets. A burst of canister smashed into the parapet in front of him. The enemy guns on the far walls were being turned to face the rush of British soldiers, and Jack could do nothing save run through the dreadful fire, trusting to fate to keep him alive. He rushed on, certain that he would be hit, his flesh clenched tight as he expected to feel the vicious kick of a ball finding its mark. The enemy poured on the fire. He heard the screams as men behind him were cut down, their dreadful cries cut short as their mates trampled over them, not one man stopping to offer aid. He felt the snap in the air as a musket ball scorched past his face. Another plucked at the side of his jacket, missing his chest by a fraction of an inch. He began to shout with rage, the lunacy of the charge across the ramparts consuming his soul. He hit the wall of bayonets like a madman and cut past the bared steel, his sword bludgeoning away into the makeshift line. He killed without hesitation, hacking at the nearest defenders like a berserker of old. A man fell away, his head half severed by Jack's first blow. Another followed within the space of a single heartbeat, his face a mask of blood from where Jack had cut away his eyes. A rebel sepoy thrust a bayonet at Jack's guts, his teeth bared as he tried to ram the steel hard into the phalange's flesh. Jack laughed as he battered the blade aside, before stepping forward and slamming his head into the sepoy's face, butting the man to the ground. The line was backing away as the ragtag band that followed Jack charged into them. The fight was short and bloody. Men fell from both sides, their screams loud in the cramped confines of the rampart. Jack hacked another rebel down, his sword used with all the finesse of a butcher's cleaver as he beat his foe into bloody submission. Then there was no one left to fight. There were no cheers. The men who fought with Jack were exhausted. Yet there could be no rest. The moment the enemy broke, their fellows opened fire once more. A grey-coated soldier from the 1st Bengal Fusiliers spun around in front of Jack, his face shattered by a well-aimed musket ball. Jack heard the cries as more men were hit, the victors of the squalid melee beginning to fall all around him. "Follow me!" There was nowhere else to go but forward, so he pressed on, his lungs straining with the effort. He forced away the hurt and thought only of the next fight and the next man he would kill. Yet even the sustaining rage of battle was flagging. Another burst of canister smashed into the parapet a few yards behind him, snatching half a dozen men into oblivion. Their bodies were torn apart by the close-range fire, the stone of the rampart slick with their blood. Still Jack pounded forward, even though he had no notion of where he was. He dashed through a deserted tower and then on, out of its shade and back into the glare of the sun. Bullets snapped all around him, eroding his courage and driving away the last of the madness. Yet he could not turn. He could only run along the rampart, his terror building with every step, the icy wash of fear quenching the flame of madness that had driven him into the fight. He rounded another bend and nearly collided with a wounded sepoy. The man was trying to flee, but he had taken a bayonet thrust to the neck and he was slow. Blood flowed freely over the fingers of the hand that was pressed into the gaping hole in his flesh. Jack felt nothing as he saw the dreadful wound. The man turned, and there was time enough for Jack to see the spasm of fear surge across his face before he chopped down his sabre, cutting it hard into the joint of neck and shoulder. The man cried out and fell to his knees, his bloodied face lifting to stare back at Jack with accusing eye. Jack lashed out, callous in his shame, his boot driving into the man's side and knocking him to the ground. It cleared the way forward, and he stepped over the thrashing body and forced himself back into a trot. But the collision had scoured the very last of the madness from his soul. The sight of the man's fear had fueled Jack's own. He wanted to drop to the ground, to curl into a ball and hide, to do anything that would get him out of the dreadful fire that flensed the walls. He felt alone. He turned his head and looked for the men who followed. They seemed far away, and his pace slowed to a walk. He was watching them as a burst of canister found its mark. The men leading the rush were scythed down, a bright spray of blood thrown high into the air, their deaths brutal and sudden. Others still came on, rushing through the slaughter, keeping going no matter how many fell. Jack turned away. His legs trembled and threatened to send him tumbling to the ground, but he forced them to carry him. He focused his gaze on the next tower, and on the rebels who were hastily forming yet another line to block his path. He demanded that his body obey and fought away the fear that threatened to unman him. He wanted to cry out, as the storm of fire seemed to increase. He had never known a fear like it. Yet still his boots pounded into the stone of the ramparts, his eyes fixed on the enemy. He saw the bayonets waver. He cried out as a musket ball ricocheted off the stone and flew up past his face. Then he hit them. The madness was gone, and he flailed his sword, trying not to die. He parried a bayonet thrust at his groin before twisting and battering away another coming for his throat. He keened as he fought, his desire to live surging up like blood from a slit throat. The emotions he had denied since he had lost armourer swept through him, and he wept, his tears carving channels through the sweat and grime and blood on his face. The men who had followed him ploughed into the enemy. Somehow they were finding the strength to fight on, their battle rage sustaining them past the point of exhaustion. The men could not stand against them, and they ran, barely half those who had stood in the line able to escape. Jack staggered to one side. He was utterly spent. "Forward, men!" He heard the fresh voice and saw the bright face of Lieutenant Lang going past, specks of blood like engorged freckles on the young officer's face. Jack looked back, trying to understand how far they had come. He could barely credit what he saw. The men on the ramparts had done so much more than had been expected of them. The Kabul gate, their original objective, lay behind them, a bullet-holed Union Jack now flying from its top. Ahead lay the Lahore gate and the bastion that protected it. He saw the guns that now pointed towards the ramparts, and he understood where the brutal enemy fire had come from. The enemy were turning the Lahore bastion into a fortress. They had thrown a hasty barricade across the rampart and realigned a cannon so that its gaping maw pointed towards the British infantrymen rushing towards them. Behind them the enemy formed ranks, a double line of muskets ready to blast a volley at any enemy soldiers foolish enough to attack. As Jack watched, they opened fire. The cannon fired first. It was loaded with canister and it swept away the leading ranks of the rampaging British. The first musket volley followed within moments, striking into the battered ranks of those attackers left standing. Men crumpled, dozens struck down by the close-range fire. The assault died in the passage of no more than 3 heartbeats, the bodies of the fallen creating a bloody obstacle to those trying to follow. Jack watched Lieutenant Lang. The young officer kept going, doing his best to pick his way through the tattered flesh that lined the rampart, but there was hardly a soul left to follow him, and he advanced alone. "Pull back!" Jack's voice was huge. He strode forward, summoning the strength from he knew not where. "Pull back!" He bellowed the order, waving his arm to emphasize the bitter command. The few men left standing needed no urging. They came back at a rush, their faces white with terror. Jack forced himself to stand still. He waited, resisting the urge to join the retreat to the Kabul gate and the sanctuary of the bastion's thick stone walls. "Lang! Pull back!" He roared the order and saw the look of confusion on the young officer's face. Then the enemy cannon fired again. Jack saw Lang's uniform twitch around his thin body as the storm of shot seared past him. It was as if he stood in a gale, but somehow the tempest passed and he was still standing, his body unscathed. "Come on!" Jack yelled in encouragement. He started to move, taking the first hesitant steps backwards, but with his body still inclined towards Lang. Bullets spat into the ground around the engineer officer's feet, sending up puffs of dust as they smacked into the stone, but he was leading a charmed life and he bounded forward, somehow staying alive. "Go, go!" Jack only started to run as the lieutenant reached him, and they fell back side by side. The air was alive with the snap and crack of passing bullets, yet they were a fair distance away and getting further with every step as the 2 men made for the safety of the Kabul bastion. They threw themselves to the ground the moment they reached the cover of the bastion's walls. Jack slid to a halt, his body shuddering with fear and with the effort of making his escape. Lang lay at his side, panting and shocked, his face ashen. A voice shouted from behind, "What the hell is happening here?" Jack lifted his head and looked at the flushed and florid face of an officer wearing the insignia of a brigadier. He spat, clearing his throat of dust and the sour taste of fear. "They hold the Lahore gate." He forced out the words, levering himself to his feet. Men crouched all around him, the remnants of the bloody assault along the ramparts hiding in any cover they could find. Their wild attack was over. "Reload!" Jack snapped the order. The men were exhausted and frightened, and he knew they needed to be taken in hand. He saw them reach for their ammunition pouches, the instinct to obey driven deep. He looked back at the brigadier. "Order, sir?" The officer looked hard at Jack before nodding in approval. "Hold here, Lieutenant." "Lark." Jack turned and spat once more before wiping his hand across his face, smearing away the blood, the sweat and the tears. "My name is Jack Lark." "Then hold here, Mr. Lark. I'll send you orders just as soon as I can." The brigadier said nothing more before he left at a trot. Jack grunted, then turned to face his bloodied command. The men were sucking on the soda water bottles that many carried in place of regular canteens. Their eyes showed bright against their filth-encrusted faces, reflecting the wild stares of men in battle. Jack felt a fierce pride at what they had achieved. They might have been beaten back, but he knew Nicholson would be proud of their efforts. They had secured the column's objective. The Kabul gate was theirs. Chapter 40. "Sir, Mr. Lark." Jack started as he heard his name. He had been leaning against a wall. The stone was cold on his cheek, the sensation of delight as the heat of the day began to build. He looked at the young ensign who had come to deliver fresh orders. The boy could not have been more than 16 years old. Yes? Orders from General Nicholson, sir. The young officer's voice cracked as he delivered his precious instructions. Leave enough men to hold the rampart, then bring the rest back down and rejoin the general. Jack nodded, looking at the pitiful band he ostensibly commanded. He had men from all 3 of the battalions in Nicholson's column, with a smattering of green-jacketed riflemen from the 60th. It was not much of a command, but it was his, and he hesitated, reluctant to leave the men who had fought with him. They had done their best to make a defensive position. They had turned one of the captured guns in the bastion around so that it faced out towards the Lahore gate. They had loaded it with canister and readied it to fire should the enemy decide to try to retake what it had lost. The men had reloaded their rifles and would be able to pour on a heavy fire should they be attacked. Jack looked at Lieutenant Lang. The engineer officer was ashen-faced and grey-eyed, but he was still whole, and he would have to take command. Jack would lead as many of the men as he felt they could spare and obey the order Nicholson had sent him. It meant returning to the hottest part of the battle for the city, but it would also give him his best chance of finding armourer. He forced away the tiredness and began giving his orders. Jack! Over here, man! Nicholson waved Jack towards him as he led his ragtag band down from the ramparts. He made his way to join the general, bending low so as not to attract the attention of the enemy musketeers, who were sending occasional shots towards the battered British infantry. The remains of the Bengal Fusiliers huddled at the base of the wall facing the Lahore gate. Jack saw that their ranks had been shredded by the charge into the breach and the vicious fighting that had followed. They had cut their way towards the gate, fighting hand to hand against the superior number of rebel sepoys in the narrow streets and the houses that pressed close against the walls. The fighting had been bloody and bitter, and they had taken the ground a foot at a time, paying a heavy toll in lives lost. Their companies were badly disorganized, and the few officers left standing were commanding the men in whatever groups they happened to be in. Jack crouched at Nicholson's side behind a low wall that ran around the back of one of the mud and thatch houses. He saw the strain on the general's face, the stress of commanding the attack etched into every pore. He also noticed the blood on Nicholson's sword. Clearly the general was still leading from the front. We have done well, but I must confess it has not gone all our own way. Nicholson greeted Jack's arrival with a hint of a smile. Despite his obvious exhaustion, there was a glimmer of passion in Nicholson's eyes as he spoke. Jack did not have the energy to reply, but the general carried on talking, as if relieved to finally have someone to converse with. Reed and his men have been beaten back. I just spoke to Grant, and he told me that the enemy have launched a counterattack and driven Reed's column back as far as Subzi Mandi. Grant's brigade is exposed outside the walls and is taking heavy fire from the Lahore bastion. They can advance no further until it is taken. Jack glanced at the bastion which loomed over them. A narrow alley ran between the lines of houses, pointing directly towards the defensive position that had become the critical point in the battle. The third column is faring better. It took the Kashmir Gate and is now fighting towards the Jama Masjid. Nicholson stopped talking and looked at Jack. We must take the Lahore Gate. Are you with me? Jack had said nothing as he listened to the general's curt appraisal of the situation. It was clear the pace of the assault was slowing, the lack of numbers in the columns beginning to make itself felt the longer the battle went on. He looked up at the Lahore bastion again. He understood why Nicholson needed to take it. If the remains of the British infantry could break through one last time, there was every chance that the enemy would fold. It was the decisive moment of the battle. I'll come. His voice cracked as he spoke for the first time. Good fellow. Nicholson took his arm in a tight grip and stared at him intently, his eyes full of wild passion. Let us get this done. Jack nodded. It would take one final wild charge, and the city would be theirs. Bengal Fusiliers, on your feet! Nicholson's voice was huge as he rose from behind the shelter of the broken wall. He looked like a warrior of old, looming over his men, his physical presence bearing down upon them. On your feet! He stalked forward, urging the men to stand. The enemy saw him and their fire intensified. The air around him stung repeatedly as bullets seared past. Jack pushed himself to his feet. His legs trembled with the effort, but he forced them to obey him and walked forward, following the general into the enemy fire. The faces of the Fusiliers peered up as the two officers passed by. To a man, they were terrified. Not one of them moved. Nicholson walked forward calmly, his sword held low in his right hand. Jack followed, stumbling over broken stones and the wreckage of the fight. Powder smoke billowed past them, the familiar stench of rotten eggs sticking in his throat and making him want to gag. They passed the last of the Fusiliers, the ones closest to the enemy. Nicholson looked behind him. For a single heartbeat he caught Jack's eye. Then he turned back to face the bastion that dominated the end of the alleyway ahead. Follow me! Nicholson roared the command. He did not look to see if anyone obeyed. He raised his sword and began to run. The alley was narrow. Jack felt the danger in the constricted space as he began to run after Nicholson. His scabbard flapped against his leg and his breath roared in his ears as he pounded forward. Nicholson was already yards ahead, charging on alone, his sword raised high as he mounted a one-man assault on the great bastion. The first Bengal Fusiliers had not moved. Jack slowed and turned back to face them. On your fucking feet! Now! He stalked towards them, his fury driving him on, his fear forgotten as he bawled at the men who refused to follow the example set by their general. He reached the closest Fusilier and hauled him to his feet, forcing him into the alley. On your feet! Move! He was like a man possessed. He grabbed at the grey flannel jackets, heaving the men out from their cover and shoving them towards the bastion. Charge! Nicholson's voice called for them to follow his lead. The general had not paused but rushed on, braving the enemy fire alone. This time the Fusiliers responded. They looked like ghosts, their faces matching the colour of their jackets. Like an army of the dead, they rose from their hiding places and stormed forward, finally following the example that had been set. Jack went with them. He felt nothing as the first Fusiliers began to fall, the enemy fire knocking men from their feet. He felt no guilt at having summoned them to their deaths. He thought only of following Nicholson and repaying the courage the general had spent. Forward! The Fusiliers began to cheer as they rushed towards the enemy bastion. Their heavy boots pounded into the ground and they charged fast down the alleyway. Jack felt something of the former battle madness return, and he fanned the flames of his fury, summoning the courage he would need for one final fight. The enemy saw them coming. Their fire intensified, the rebels reloading with desperate haste as they tried to turn back the grey-jacketed tide that stormed towards them. The rebel guns opened fire. Every cannon that could be brought to bear on their narrow alley fired, a dreadful storm of canister cutting through the Fusiliers. Many were struck down, the tightly packed ranks torn apart as the deadly hail slashed through them. Jack tripped, the headless corpse of a Fusilier tumbling around his ankles. He went down hard, the breath driven from his lungs as he hit the ground. He tried to get to his feet, but the dusty soil was slick with blood and he slipped. his hand sliding through the gore that lay thick around them. He lifted his head. To his disgust, the Fusiliers were turning back. Dozens of bodies littered the ground, the enemy fire gutting the men who had dared to lead the charge. Those that followed had balked at the spread of corpses blocking the alley and started to retreat, the charge beaten back by the dreadfully accurate enemy fire. It was then that Jack saw Nicholson turn. The general was quite alone. He saw Nicholson's mouth open as he roared at the Fusiliers to stand, but his words were drowned out by another deafening volley of rebel artillery. Jack flinched, burying his head against the body of the corpse that had tripped him. The canister roared past above his head, the air battered by the storm of shot. When he looked up, Nicholson was gone. He struggled to his feet and lurched into motion. He went forward alone, following in the steps of the general. With the men of the Fusiliers in full retreat, the enemy fire slackened, as if the rebels were sickened by the slaughter they had created in the dank, narrow alley. Nicholson lay in the gutter. He was bleeding like a stuck pig. "You're hit." Jack croaked the words as he went on his knees beside Nicholson's head. A few stray shots came his way, but he paid them no heed. His nerves stretched too thin to be concerned, even as a bullet gouged a crack in the wall no more than 6 inches from his head. "Yes, yes." Nicholson sounded more annoyed than in pain. Jack reached forward and pulled back the folds of Nicholson's jacket. His shirt was soaked in blood. A musket ball had hit his chest just below the armpit. There was little hope with such a wound, but Jack reached down anyway and took a firm grip under Nicholson's shoulders. "For pity's sake, I order you to leave me here and return to the men. I shall stay here until the city is taken." Nicholson tried to swat Jack's hands away, but there was no strength left in his great arms. Jack ignored the order. He took firm hold and started to drag Nicholson back, cursing as the motion pulled at his own barely healed wound. Slowly, and step by bloody step, he hauled the general towards the remains of the Bengal Fusiliers. The enemy fire died away, leaving him in peace. He did not know if it was out of mercy, some misplaced notion of kindness, or whether the enemy was simply as sick of killing as he himself had become. He reached the safety of the Kabul gate and dragged the general into the shelter of the walls, ignoring the bloody trail he had left in the dust. "Damn fool!" Nicholson still had the strength to curse at Jack. "Organize the men! Stop wasting time!" Jack turned away. He looked at the men of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers. Not one could meet his eye. They huddled down in cover, their heads buried, their hands shaking. "Sergeant!" Jack was not finished. He saw a grey jacket with the bright white chevrons of a sergeant. "Sergeant!" He was forced to repeat his summons, even the experienced non-commissioned officer trying to avoid his demanding voice. "Sir!" The sergeant clambered to his feet. He still clutched his Enfield, its bayonet bloodied to the hilt. He had not shirked from the fight. "Summon a Dolly. The general is to be taken to the rear." "Yes, sir." The sergeant seemed relieved to be given such an undemanding task. Jack looked around. He couldn't see another officer, he just saw the beaten and bloodied remains of a battalion that had suffered too much that day. "Reload." He spoke softly, stalking around the broken ranks. "Make sure you're loaded. Find ammunition caps if you need them. Get ready." To his amazement, the men responded. The bitter silence was broken as the men began to shuffle around, looking for ammunition or for fresh firing caps for their rifles. Others began reloading, the routine task returning some degree of order to the battered battalion. They might have been beaten back, but they were still British redcoats. Jack smiled. He should not have doubted the indomitable spirit of the forgotten men who fought behind the 17 inches of British steel. They still had plenty of fight in them. They just needed to be shown the way. "Lark!" He heard Nicholson call for him, the general's voice little more than a whisper. He walked closer, bending low so that he could hear the words. "Hold here. Do not give up what we have gained." Jack nodded. He stood back as a pair of doly bearers rushed up, followed by the Fusilier sergeant who had summoned them. They worked quickly, bundling Nicholson up with rough and hasty hands. "Hey!" Jack reached forward and took a firm hold on one of the bearers' arms. "He is our general. Take more care." The native bearer stared at Jack as if he were mad. But they finished getting Nicholson into the doly, and Jack could do nothing but stand back and let them leave. He would rather have trusted the general's care to men from the Bengal Fusiliers, but he knew Nicholson would tear a strip off his hide if he tried. The bearers went off at a fast trot. The inspirational leader of the British troops was gone. It was down to the line officers to hold on to what had been won. The time for grand strategy was over. The moment had come to put faith in an Enfield rifle, a steel bayonet, and the exhausted and bloody soldier who stood behind it. Chapter 41. Take cover! The remnants of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers crouched in whatever shelter they could find as the enemy opened fire. The rebels had brought forward 2 light cannon, and now they began to batter the huddle of grey-jacketed men who refused to retreat. The storm of canister cracked against the walls of the Kabul gate, tearing huge splinters out of the already heavily pitted stone. The Fusiliers crouched low behind their cover, yet they no longer cowered. Each man's rifle was loaded, the bayonet-tipped Enfields ready to defend the gate. There were barely 200 men left, but Jack had them in hand. They would obey the general's final order. They would hold what they had won. They came at them then, a wave of screaming hatred that surged towards the thin line of Fusiliers. Jack peered around the cover of the wall that he was hiding behind and stared at the enemy that came on in a mob, hundreds, perhaps thousands strong. The defenders were outnumbered many times over. He readied himself. He had reloaded his revolver, his shaking hands fumbling with the ammunition, but finally getting the weapon ready for the fight he had known to be inevitable. He closed his eyes and tried to summon the image of Armourer's face as a talisman to keep him safe in the fight. But the hazy, undefined picture that formed in his mind meant nothing. He shivered, a surge of grief sprinting down his spine, followed by a great shudder that resonated deep in his being. He opened his eyes and knew for certain that she was lost. He shook his head, trying to dispel the haunting notion. The realization stunned him. Armourer had been lost since the moment the rebels had carried her back into the city. The bitter certainty eroded the last vestiges of his hope. "Here they come!" Jack stared at the swarm that thundered towards them. He would follow the sole course of action left open to him. He was a redcoat, so he would do the only thing he knew. He would fight. "Stand to!" Jack bellowed the order and strode into the light. The glare dazzled him, but he walked forward nonetheless, taking his place in the centre of the Fusiliers. They formed a rough line, half the men in cover, half in the open, but every gun faced the enemy, every barrel ready to fire. "Prepare to fire!" Jack slipped the revolver from its holster with his left hand. He gripped the hilt of his sabre in his right. He thought of the fabulous weapon he had once owned, the sword of a prince that had once meant so much to him. He smiled at his foolishness. He was a butcher. It did not matter what manner of weapon he held. "Fire!" The Fusilier's volley crashed out. The rifles fired as one, a single great thunderclap of sound. The heavy bullets tore into the mass of humanity that charged towards them. Men were torn apart, limbs ripped from bodies, blood showering bright in the sunlight. The head of the attacking mob was gutted, great holes blown in the tightly packed ranks as every British bullet found its mark in flesh. "Charge! Charge!" Jack felt the madness of battle return and take its remorseless hold over his soul. He submitted to it with relief, grateful for its return, for the wonderful oblivion of hatred. He fired his revolver as he ran forward, pulling the trigger again and again. He cared nothing for the men he struck down, picking out targets without a thought. Charge! The enemy had taken appalling casualties, but still they came on. This was no battle on an open field. In the cramped confines of the city street, the fight would be brutal. With no way to escape, both sides knew they had to kill or be killed. There could be no retreat. Jack slashed at the first face he saw. He whooped in a savage delight as he cut the man down, barely noting his civilian garb. He cut backhanded, slicing his sword across another man's midriff before punching it forward and driving the point into a sepoy's chest. He went wild. He gave no thought to defence and flailed his sword around his head before half severing a grey-bearded jihadi's neck. A bayonet grazed his ribs, but he felt nothing, and slammed the hilt of his revolver into a pagdy-covered face, bludgeoning his attacker to the ground. Around him, the survivors of the Bengal Fusiliers were fighting hard. They drove into the enemy ranks, thrusting with their rifles and punching the heavy steel bayonets into body after body. Many were cut down in turn, the enemy refusing to shirk the fight. Talwars flashed in the searing sun as the jihadis cut at the Fusiliers, the heavy swords butchering the men who fought on no matter how many of their fellows were struck down. A talwar slashed past Jack's face. It came so close that he felt the wash of air as the edge missed his cheek by no more than an inch. He twisted hard and bellowed with fierce elation as he sliced his own sword into a man's chin, cutting it up through mouth and nose. He kicked out as he drove onward, slamming his boot into another man's groin before driving the sword forward again, taking a screaming rebel in the mouth. He no longer knew where he was. All he could do was kill. The enemy were backing away from him, refusing to fight the butcher who killed with dreadful skill. Jack roared at them, daring them to come against him. He was covered with gore, his khaki uniform thick with blood and scraps of flesh. He cursed the men who would not fight him, his screams driving them back still further. His rage was fueled by grief, the loss of armourer more than he could bear. It sustained him, lending him strength, feeding his desire to kill. He went forward, stamping over the flesh of the dying and slashing his sword at any living soul he could reach. The enemy had seen enough. They backed away further, and then, with a cry of terror, they broke. Jack roared in frustration and made to go after them. A strong arm pulled at his shoulder. "Sir." He whirled on the spot. He saw the sergeant who had organised Nicholson's litter. The man stepped back, lifting his arm, as if Jack was going to come at him with the gore-covered sword that had killed so many. "It's over, sir. Time to get back." Jack staggered, his mind unable to grasp that the fight was finished. "Time to get back, sir." The sergeant gave the instruction for a second time. This time it was enough to pierce the bloodlust. Jack lowered his sword. His boot kicked against one of the bodies that carpeted the ground around them. He could not recall ever seeing so many in one place. It was a charnel house. Grey-jacketed corpses lay intertwined with the bodies of the enemy. A a sea of bloodied faces staring up at the sky. Some still moved, fighting against the rents and tears in their flesh, crying out for mercy, for aid, or simply for a bullet to end their agony. Others lay still, their eyes fixed open, their mouths stuck forever in the last gasp of life. "Fall back!" Jack's voice cracked. His mouth was parched, his tongue stuck against the roof of his mouth. He looked ahead. The enemy were pulling back to the Lahore gate. He thought of leading the Fusiliers forward, his instincts telling him to press home the attack. But he looked at the bloodied and exhausted men around him and knew they did not have the strength left in them. Somehow they had repelled the enemy attack, but there was a limit to how far grit and bloody-minded determination could take them, a limit they had surely left far behind. "Take back the wounded, then get into cover and reload." Jack barely had to raise his voice as he gave the orders. There were pitifully few men left to heed his command. He forced his bloodied sword back into its scabbard before he bent down and hauled a wounded Fusilier to his feet. He did not care that the man's blood soaked into his jacket as he got an arm underneath his shoulder. "God bless you, sir." The Fusilier grunted his thanks. Together they got moving, treading carefully past the ruined bodies, making slow and awkward progress back towards the Kabul gate. The great attack on Delhi was over. They held the gate. The enemy launched a dozen attacks. Nearly all made it to the gate, the rebels and the wild fanatics who had swelled their ranks going toe-to-toe with the exhausted defenders. The fights were sharp and brutal, the men hacking at each other in vicious hand-to-hand melees. Each time the rebels were repulsed. Somehow the shattered ranks of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers held on to what they had won. There was no water, no food. Bodies were strewn everywhere, the wounded lying alongside the dead. Jack led them through it all, keeping them fighting and holding the ground they had battled so hard to win. His rage was long gone, the wild emotion that had driven him into the first counter-attack long spent. He fought like an automaton, a machine of war quite without emotion. He did not know how many he had killed. The blood had dried on his uniform and his arms were bloodied to the elbows so that he looked more like a butcher than a soldier. The sun was setting when the first reinforcements reached them. To Jack's mind, they looked as battered and exhausted as the men from the 1st Bengal Fusiliers, but at least they had officers. Jack said nothing as he slipped away. The reinforcements were under the command of a major, so he left the men he had commanded throughout the long, bitter afternoon to the care of a proper officer. He had no purpose in mind as he walked. His hopeless fantasy of finding armourer had been washed away in the brutality of the fight. His anger had left him. The rage that had sustained him for so long was gone. Once again he was truly alone. "Jack?" Fred Roberts was sitting on a wooden stool outside a peasant's house, no more than 100 yards away from the fighting. He was meticulously going through the routine of reloading his revolver, but he looked up and spotted Jack staggering towards him. Jack altered his path so that he could approach the young officer. Roberts had clearly been in the fighting, his face grey with a thick layer of dirt and powder smoke. But his uniform was nothing like Jack's, and he blanched as he saw the thick layer of blood that covered his fellow officer's arms and front. "Good grief!" Roberts searched Jack's face. His brow creased in concern as he understood the trial he had endured. "Sit here, man. You look done in." Jack did as he was told. He eased himself onto the stool, moving with the grace of an old man, every part of his body protesting. "Water." He spoke for the first time, summoning the energy to find the word. "Of course. Here." Roberts rushed to get the soda bottle from around his neck. He handed it to Jack, who took it and lifted it to his mouth in one quick movement. "Nicholson is dying." The younger officer's voice quivered as he gave Jack the news. "I found him. He was lying in a ditch. The bastard bearers had left him so that they could go plundering." His voice caught and he cuffed at his eyes. "He knew he was dying. The sight of that man lying helpless and on the point of death was more than I could bear." His head hung as he finished, his chin sagging so that it rested on his chest. Jack tried to summon some emotion. He failed. He had seen too many men die that day. He could feel no more pity for a general's death than he could for that of the lowliest redcoat. He would not measure one against the other. "Have we lost, then?" The water had begun to revitalize him. For the first time in hours, he felt a tiny bit alive. "No!" Roberts was vehement in his reply. "We control around 1/4 of the city. We will hold what we have taken. Even Wilson has agreed to that. We will gather our strength, and then we will take the rest of this God-forsaken place. We shall win through. We must." Jack envied the younger officer his certainty. His own hopes lay amongst the fallen. He levered himself to his feet. He did not know where he was going, but he felt compelled to move on, to distance himself from people he knew. He handed the water bottle back to Roberts. "Thank you." "Where are you going?" Roberts asked the question, but his eyes stared at the ground. Jack was not the only one suffering that day. "I don't know." Jack took a deep breath and walked away. He wanted to find a place to hide, somewhere he could bury himself in his grief. He wanted to be alone. For Armourer was lost to him, and he did not know what to do. Chapter 42. Jack picked his way through the debris that littered the streets. Bodies lay in every direction. There were too many to collect. A rare few had been dragged to one side to be piled into grotesque heaps, but most simply lay where they had fallen. He walked through the quarter of the city that the British now controlled. The streets closest to the fighting were empty, the only living things the occasional officer or a lone runner on an errand. They were lit by fire, dozens of houses burning, casting a flickering orange light over the deserted alleyways and side streets. It was as though the city had been stripped of all life, the quiet spaces fit only for the dead. He looked up as he walked. The fires lit much of the sky, but he still found a skirmish line of stars in the darker patches. They stared down, unperturbed by the bitter squabbles of man. He drank in their serene light, feeling it find its way through the gloom that smothered his mind. Then he heard the screams. A soldier staggered out of the nearest house and steered a course towards Jack, who stared back, unable to understand what he saw. The man carried a bundle of clothes. They could not have weighed much more than a few pounds, certainly much less than the Enfield rifle that was slung over his shoulder. At first Jack supposed he had looted the house, the meagre findings a poor haul for risking the army's punishment for the breaking of orders. But the look on the soldier's face said something different. "I found him." The man spoke with an Irish accent. He searched Jack's eyes as if seeking for an answer, the words that would explain the brutality whose legacy he now cradled in his arms. "He's just a wee bairn, a wee young boy. Who would do such a thing?" The Irishman continued to stare at Jack as he asked the pointless question, his voice quivering with raw emotion. Jack felt his exhaustion slipping away. He finally understood what the soldier had found. As he came close, he saw the tiny body of a dead baby, his head staved in by the callous butt of a rifle. Put him down. You cannot help him now." Jack spoke gently as if to a frightened child. The Irishman obeyed. He placed the baby on the ground, gently patting its ruined head before sitting down heavily at its side. Jack looked down at the bundle. He didn't understand what he was doing, why he fought in a battle that would see a tiny infant slaughtered. He heard more screams, the dreadful sound of a city being put to the sword, and they drew him in like a moth pulled to the light of an oil lamp. He no longer knew who he was fighting, who was the enemy and who was on his side. He left the Irish soldier behind and walked into the city of the damned. The prisoners came out of the alley in a rush. They were crying, their dark faces streaked with tears. Their eyes shone white, their naked terror revealed. Some fell to their knees, their hands lifting towards the armed men who followed them. Their voices increased in volume as the prisoners begged for their lives, the frantic, pitiful bleats of the herd summoned to the butcher. The hard-faced man who had gathered the captives betrayed no emotion. They forced them into a huddle, their fists, boots, and rifle butts used to encourage any who disobeyed. More men were brought forward, the stragglers thrown into the pathetic crowd that keened with fear. Their capturers pulled back, forming a crude line to one side of the prisoners, who wept and cried out as they faced their deaths. Jack saw that none of the men guarding the prisoners was wearing anything that could be considered a uniform. The civilians were all white men, and their stained shirts were dotted with blood, their shirt-sleeves rolled and bunched around their upper arms as they went about their vicious work. He increased his pace. He knew what was about to happen. "Stop!" He bellowed the order, knowing it would do nothing. A few heads turned to look in his direction, but the men in the stained shirts paid him no heed. They shrugged their rifles from their shoulders and aimed them at the pathetic huddle of rebels who cowered away from the threat. They opened fire. At such close range, the bullets tore through flesh like a freshly sharpened knife would cut through silk. Bodies were torn apart, the captives cut down, not one left standing. The screaming stopped. The prisoners lay in a heap of ruined flesh. A few bodies twitched or jerked, their groans and whimpers the only sounds left after the thunder of the volley. But their murderers turned away, deaf to the suffering, their jokes and banter the only eulogy the dead would get that day. Jack would not be so easily ignored. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He felt the flames of rage beginning to burn once more. He loosened his sword in its scabbard and walked to do murder. "Who the fuck are you?" A heavy-set man stood in Jack's path. Jack did not recognize him. He could only suppose that he was one of the hundreds of civilians who had attached themselves to the British troops. These adventurers, as they were playfully titled, followed the army, searching for plunder and for revenge. Many told terrible tales of children and women killed and defiled, and now the fighting had given them the opportunity to slake their basest desires. "Shut your foul muzzle!" Jack snapped the reply and walked straight for the large man who was clearly the leader of the group. The man hefted his rifle. A thin trail of powder smoke snaked from its barrel. Jack saw the blood cake to its butt, the gruesome stains, the telling evidence that its owner had killed more men than just the ones Jack had witnessed. "Fuck off!" The man snarled the words as Jack came close. He raised the rifle, twisting it in his meaty paws so that he was ready to use it to strike. Jack stopped, no more than a pace away from him. "Now turn round and fuck off. It ain't no business of yours what we're doing. These fuckers deserve to die." The man spat the words into Jack's face. "We're going to kill everyone we find, and there ain't no one is going to stop us. So shut your muzzle and—" He never finished his sentence. Jack's bloodied sabre whispered as he drew it from the scabbard, and he cut hard, taking the man's throat and cutting off the foul tirade. The man fell to the ground, his body jerking in great spasms as he died. Jack stepped past him and stalked towards his cronies, his bloodied sword reaching for them. They looked at his face, and they ran. Jack felt no remorse at killing a man from his own side. He looked back and saw the Irishman still sitting peacefully beside the dead child. He had witnessed a mob beat a white mother and her child to death. Now he had seen the same vicious brutality brought down as retribution on any who happened to come to hand. His world had gone mad. The British might have captured this part of the city, but it was the domain of the devil. The flames rose high above the city. Huge clouds of black smoke swept up in the night sky, scraps of paper and burning embers caught up and blown far and wide. Jack felt the heat on his face as he walked through hell come to earth. He was surrounded by madness. The streets were busier as he got further away from the fighting. Groups of soldiers staggered past him, some carrying loot, others drinking. All were engaged in an orgy of theft and debauchery on such a scale that Jack could not hope to curtail it. He saw men being killed with casual disdain, the broken bodies kicked to one side. He watched a soldier from the 75th laugh as an old man begged for his life before the Highlander shot the man between the eyes. The old man fell back, his head shattered. The British soldier turned away, his face creased into a smile as he boasted to his mates of the accuracy of his aim. A soldier dressed in the dirty grey coat of the 1st Bengal Fusiliers bayoneted an old woman who screeched at him too loudly, his face emotionless as she fell to the ground at his feet. He withdrew his bayonet and turned away as if he had done nothing more than stab one of the straw bodies used on the drill square. There were soldiers aplenty in the streets closer to the breaches. Most were drunk, their officers too slow to destroy the stocks of beer and brandy the men had discovered in the streets that had been captured. The soldiers in the 4 columns had fought hard, braving the slaughter in the breaches and enduring the vicious hand-to-hand battles that had left close to 1/3 of their number stretched out on the ground. Now they claimed their reward, any vestige of discipline collapsing as they drunk themselves insensible. The officers could do nothing to stop them, and so they either retreated or joined the chaos. A young officer staggered past. Jack recognized him at once. He had been in Barnard's column that had marched through Alipur. He would have fought all those months ago at Badli Ki Sarai before enduring everything the rebel army had thrown at the ridge in the months that had followed. The officer lurched close. He was drunk, wafts of alcohol surrounding him like a cloud, and he smiled as he recognized Jack. "Well met, old fellow, well met." He reached for Jack's hand, taking it into his own before pumping it enthusiastically. "We are doing God's work this day." He burped, and Jack pulled his hand away, sickened by the man's touch. He saw fresh blood there, the gore transferred from the young officer. "I've killed the heathen." The officer's words were slurred. "We are soldiers of the Lord, and this is our divine vengeance on the godless heathen." Jack had heard enough. He punched the officer full in the mouth, knocking him to his backside. "I'm a good soldier of Christ." The officer looked astonished. He spat the words at Jack, blood and spittle flung from his mouth. For a moment Jack considered killing the foul creature in front of him, regardless of the consequences. To his eyes there was no difference between the horror being wrought on the citizens of Delhi by the British and the fate handed out by the mutineers when they had first arrived to tear the city apart with their madness. He heard the sound of horses' hooves. He tore his eyes from the bloodied face of the officer he had knocked to the ground and watched as a mounted party rode into the chaos. They brought with them another group of prisoners. Jack watched as the riders dismounted and sorted the men from the women, the soldiers in khaki uniforms impervious to the screams and cries of their captives. One man remained mounted. He controlled his troops like the leader of the battalion band conducting his musicians. Jack heard the braying voice as it issued the orders, a voice that he recognized in an instant. Shots rang out. The male prisoners died in a hail of close-range rifle fire, their captors gunning them down without a qualm. The women were destined for a very different fate, and Jack heard the bellows of laughter as the men made their choices. He was moving before he gave thought to his actions. The mounted officer was laughing. He clapped his hands with delight as he called to his men, encouraging them to the sport even though he would not participate in it himself. The laughter died when he saw Jack walking towards him with murder in his eyes. Lieutenant William Hodson looked at the man he had once commanded and whimpered in fear. Chapter 43. "Jack!" Hodson's voice rose as Jack stalked towards him. He twisted in the saddle, looking for someone to come to his aid, but his men had abandoned him, leaving him to his own devices as they prepared to satiate their basest desires. "Stay where you are." He lifted a hand to ward Jack away. "That is an order." Jack increased his pace to a trot. He stumbled, his abused body struggling to respond to his command, but he found his footing and staggered on, his eyes never once leaving Hodson's pale moon face. "Jack Lark!" Hodson yelped Jack's name, then took one last look around, hopeful that there would be someone to save him. Seeing no one, he turned his horse's head and jammed his spurs into its side. The animal sensed its rider's fear. It had been worked hard since early that morning. Hodson had ridden with the cavalry column, and they had been under fire for most of the day. The first and second columns had failed to capture the Lahore bastion, and its guns had exacted a dreadful toll on the mounted troops. The mare was exhausted, and it reared, lashing its hooves at the air as it felt the sudden pain of the spur. Hodson had been twisting in the saddle, his eyes roving the street for assistance. He had not been concentrating on his mount, and his balance had been too far back. As the animal reared, Hodson fell backwards, tumbling out of the saddle with a shriek that was cut off abruptly as he hit the ground. Jack was on him in a heartbeat. He stood over his former commander, his breath coming in tortured gasps. Hodson writhed on the ground, struggling to lever himself up. "Don't you fucking move!" Jack's rage had him firmly in its grasp. He thrust his sword forward, holding the tip an inch from Hodson's throat. Hodson went still. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he sucked in air, the fall from his horse leaving him winded. Slowly and carefully he lowered himself back to the ground. The sword followed him, the tip pressing forward. "Get that thing away from me." He panted the words, his body racked by great heaving shudders as he tried to talk and force breath back into his lungs at the same time. His eyes never left the tip of Jack's sword. "You'll hang," he gulped, gagging on his fear. "Kill me, and you'll hang." The bluster gushed forth in a torrent. "So be it." Jack sneered as he looked down at the man underneath his sword. He pressed the blade forward, the tip scoring into Hodson's throat and drawing blood. "No!" Hodson screamed in his voice shrill. "Don't kill me! Don't kill me!" His hands flapped at the sword, trying to push it away. But Jack held it still and eased more force into the blade, letting it pierce the delicate flesh at the base of Hodson's throat. Hodson's hands fell to the ground where they clawed at the dirt. "Don't kill me! I beg you!" He wept, his fear leaking out of him. Jack sensed men watching him. To kill Hodson would be to ordain his own death. But he no longer cared. He had lost everything, and he could not go on. He could no longer be the killer he was expected to be, the follower of orders who thought nothing of the right and wrong of what he did. He eased his weight forward. It was time to follow his conscience. The last indecision left his mind, and he pushed the blade down. "Jack!" A new voice called to him. He started the blade lifting as he searched to find the person who could not be there. Hodson was forgotten, and Jack twisted on the spot, his head turning frantically in every direction. Then he saw her. "You will hang, you blackguard!" Hodson was scrabbling to his feet. He screeched at Jack, his humiliation driving him to confront his tormentor, no matter that blood still trickled from the wound on his neck. Jack whirled on the spot. The sabre whispered through the air, the movement so quick that Hodson could not avoid it. He had turned his wrist so that the blade hit vertically, and it slammed against Hodson's skull with the dull, flat sound of a hammer hitting wood. The blow felled him, and he crumpled, falling to the ground as if every bone in his body had been turned to jelly. Jack did not so much as glance at the man he had knocked insensible. He looked only at the girl he had thought to be lost. He had been utterly wrong. He had found Armourer. Jack ran to her. He no longer felt his body, the battering it had taken that day lost in the swirl of emotions that scourged through him. "Jack!" This time the cry was cut off as a hand was clamped hard over her mouth. The tall soldier dressed in the khaki of Hodson's troop pulled at her, his free hand taking hold of her hair as he hauled her along. Jack did not shout. He did not order for her to be let go. He just ran. The soldier saw him coming. The face under the scarlet pagdy scowled as he watched Jack approach, taking him as a rival for the girl. Holding Armourer tight, he slipped his hand to his belt and drew a knife. Jack spotted the movement. He did not care about the threat, even as the stubby blade pointed towards him. His sabre was bloodied to the hilt. Barely an inch of steel was left unblemished, the blade dulled and pitted from the day's fighting, yet it was still sharp enough to kill a man. He ignored the knife aimed at his belly. He lifted his sword and held it at eye level. He said nothing, but the threat was naked. The soldier flinched as the blade rose towards his face. He stepped back, thrusting Armourer before him, his knife held out to ward the grim-faced officer away. Jack stepped forward and took Armourer's arm. He pulled her forward, his eyes never leaving the native soldier's face. His sword did not move. He would not hesitate to fight, to cut down the man who stood in front of him. The soldier understood. He kept backing away, then he dropped his knife and ran. Finally, Jack lowered the sabre that had killed so many men that day. It fell from his hand, the bloodied blade clattering to the ground. He reached for her then, a feeling of such relief surging through him that he nearly sank to his knees. She batted his hands away and bent to snatch up her captor's fallen knife. She lifted the blade, holding it in front of her with both hands. Jack searched her face, trying to find the girl he had known. "Get away from me!" The words came as little more than a snarl. The blade lowered so that it aimed at his groin. "Armourer." Jack spoke her name. He did not turn or shield himself from the blade that could disembowel him at a stroke. She stared at him then. "I am not who I once was." When she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless. "I don't care." Jack choked on the words. Armourer said nothing. For a moment he thought she would come at him, the blade still held low and ready to strike. He would not stop her if she attacked, would not defend himself. If she wanted his death, she could have it. She stared at him, her eyes dry and her face set hard. Then she let the blade go. It tumbled to the floor, hitting the ground with a dull thud, coming to rest next to the bloodied sabre. They sat in the darkness, away from the flames and the killing. They were alone, hidden in the shadows of the great wall. The light of the stars flickered across their faces, yet both stared at the ground. Each was lost in their own thoughts, the weeks spent apart now a gulf between them. Jack wanted to look at her, to drink in her image and refresh the faded picture that he had carried in his head for so long. Yet he could not bring himself to do it. The shame hung heavy around his neck, and he struggled under the burden. Armourer sat with her arms wrapped tight around her knees, and now at last she peered over the barricade and studied his face.
The scar makes you look older.
Jack's hand lifted to his cheek. His fingers traced the thick wheal of skin, the legacy of the blow he had taken in the fight when he had lost her. Armourer reached forward. Her fingers eased his to one side and she touched the raised flesh. Her fingers flickered across his face, her touch as light as a gossamer veil. He shivered as if a ghost had walked across his grave.
I'm sorry.
He whispered the words. He had wasted days thinking what he would say if he found her. In the depths of battle he had been certain that she had been lost. The bitter grief had given him the strength to fight on, his fury sustaining him far past the point of exhaustion. Now he had found her, and he could offer her nothing save for the pathetic blandishment of a child.
No.
Armorer's voice was cold, but it was firm.
Do not be sorry.
Her hand drew back.
I told you, we do not choose our fate.
She shrank away, her arms gripping tightly around her legs once again.
I tried to get to you. I tried. Hush.
Armourer stopped him, the sound sharp. Jack closed his eyes against the pain. But he had to know, and he opened them again and met her stare, refusing to look away.
I would know what happened.
She looked at him for a long time. He could see the light of the stars reflected in her eyes. He searched them for the spark of life that had so captivated him from the first moment he had seen her all those months before. It was gone. Her eyes were blank.
They beat me.
Armourer started to speak. She did not flinch from his gaze, matching his stare with a chilling nothingness.
Then they took me away. I think they meant to kill me, but one of the men, the one who took me, he liked me. He took me and kept me.
Jack could no longer meet her stare. He looked away. The truth shamed him.
He is dead now.
Armourer reached forward and cupped her hand on Jack's cheek, hiding the scar under her palm. She turned him back to face her, forcing him to look at her.
I killed him.
She held him tight. Her hand was warm on his skin, its touch burning his flesh. Their faces were as close as lovers, her lips so near that he could feel the wash of her breath on his own.
Your mother? She died that first morning. She was dead before we even left the city.
Armourer shuddered and let him go.
I do not blame you. You fought for me. You gave me a life when I had no expectation of one. And I am glad to see you one last time. We are together now. We can still have a life. Jack knew he was wasting his breath, but he begged anyway. He had found her, yet she was still lost to him. It does not need to end. No. You must go. I would stay. Jack's voice betrayed his hurt. No. Armourer's voice was emotionless. You have nothing here. I have you. He blurted out the words. He did not care that he revealed the most intimate depths of his soul. He could not lose her, not now. You do not have me. I am not yours. I am no one's now. The girl you knew is dead. And finally, he understood. Armourer was gone. She would not return. The woman at his side was a stranger. I would stay anyway. He spoke earnestly. I would ask for nothing. He reached for her, but she flinched from his touch, her body recoiling. She looked away and said nothing more. He knew then that she would not change her mind, that he would never be able to ease her suffering. He would be a constant reminder, a link to a past that she would want to obliterate from her mind. His presence would drive her mad. He eased himself to his feet. He felt the pain in his body then, the dull ache of wounds both old and new. He stood there gazing down at her for a long time. She did not look at him again. At last he turned and walked away. Epilogue. Jack watched the earth as it was thrown onto the body. No one had stopped him from attending the simple funeral, not one officer denying his right to be there, even though he was no longer dressed in uniform, his blood-stained khaki coat replaced by the civilian clothes he had not worn since he had first met Hodson so many months before. There were more officers present than he had expected to see. So many had been killed or languished amongst the ranks of the wounded. It was a measure of Nicholson's stature that those still on their feet had found the energy to attend the simple service at the entrance to the Kashmir Gate. Jack had not been a party to the fighting as the British forces ground their way through Delhi one house and one street at a time. The casualty rate was dreadful, but day by day and hour by bloody hour, the mutineers and jihadis had lost heart, deserting the city in droves, leaving it to endure the revenge of the British soldiers. And it was a bloody revenge. Thousands were killed, the battered British soldiers paying the rebels back for every hour of the bitter months they had endured on the ridge. It took 6 days of hard fighting to reach the Red Fort. By then, the rebels had largely fled, and when the assault was launched on the Emperor's palace, it was met with little resistance. Delhi once again belonged to the British. Jack looked at the body that was slowly disappearing under the thin crust of dirt. He had not liked Nicholson. The man was too driven, too wrapped up in his own greatness to be called a friend. But he had admired him nonetheless, his determination and dedication making him the kind of officer the British infantry needed. Thinking of officers turned his thoughts to Hodson. Jack had not fathomed the whimsical nature of fate. Hodson had been spared, but Nicholson had died. Hodson now lorded it over the city like a great warrior king, whilst Nicholson was consigned to a soldier's grave. Jack's former commander had even managed to enhance his reputation still further by capturing the sons of Bahadur Shah and then killing them all, gunning them down himself with just a single carbine. More deaths. More souls sacrificed in the bitter battle between the rebels and their former masters. Jack was about to slip away from the funeral when he spied Fred Roberts standing alone.
His former tent-mate held his forage cap in his hands, and his head was bowed. Jack saw the trace of tears on the young officer's face. He might not have shared Roberts's adoration of the man now lying in a canvas shroud, but he knew what it was to suffer loss, and he walked over and stood at the younger man's shoulder. Here. He fished in his pocket and retrieved the envelope Roberts had given him before the battle. He knew it was the last chance he would get to return it. I said I would give it back to you.
Thank you.
Roberts took the slim package, nodding his head in gratitude at Jack's gesture. They stood together in silence, watching as the men tasked with Nicholson's burial continued to shovel the earth over his body.
And so it ends.
Roberts broke the spell. No, it never ends. Jack tasted the words. He was speaking his thoughts for the first time, ones he did not truly understand.
It shall not end until every damn rebel is brought to justice.
There was fire in Roberts's voice. But Jack had none left in his belly. His anger was fully spent. He had nothing left to sustain him. And then what? How many must die to satisfy our desire for power?
I don't think I like your tone.
Roberts was huffy. He scowled at Jack. Jack shook his head at the reaction. Men like you will never understand.
Men like me?
There was a hint of bitterness in Roberts's reply.
You are not like me, then? Like us?
No, I'm not. Jack stared the boy in the eye, refusing to flinch from the look of accusation he saw there. I wanted to be. Jesus, I've spent years trying to be just like you. He shook his head. He was finally coming to understand what dwelt deep inside him. But I know now that I never will be.
Then I pity you.
Robert scowled, his face screwed up in youthful arrogance.
Do not pity me, Fred.
Jack smiled at the display. I know what I am now. I don't have to pretend any more. He felt a single spark ignite in his soul. It was time to stop the pretense. It was time to put an end to his career as an imposter. He did not say farewell. He walked away from Roberts, turning his back on the British Army and the men who had controlled him.